The dynasty that built the most powerful kingdom in medieval Europe also perfected the art of consuming itself. The Plantagenets, whose rule over England stretched from 1154 to 1485, did not merely experience the ordinary tensions of royal succession or the commonplace friction between ambitious nobles and cautious monarchs. They engineered, through deliberate choice and pathological repetition, a sustained program of betrayal directed inward at their own children, their own brothers, their own blood. No external enemy, no invading force, no plague or famine accomplished what the Plantagenets accomplished against themselves across more than 3 centuries of extraordinary internal destruction. The story of their downfall is not a story of weakness. It is, in the most troubling sense possible, a story of remarkable capability turned entirely against its own source. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. To understand the particular quality of Plantagenet betrayal, it is necessary to understand where the dynasty came from and what it inherited at the moment of its founding. The man who would become the first Plantagenet king of England arrived not as a conqueror imposing a new order, but as the resolution of a catastrophe that had already been unfolding for 19 years. The period known as the Anarchy, which consumed England from 1135 to 1154, had demonstrated with brutal clarity what happened when the mechanisms of royal succession collapsed. The civil war between King Stephen of Blois and Empress Matilda, daughter of the previous king, Henry I, had devastated the English countryside, emptied the treasury, and shattered the administrative infrastructure that made centralized governance possible. Castles had proliferated beyond royal control. Barons had claimed quasi-independent authority over vast territories. The ordinary populations of the English countryside had suffered the grinding consequences of a conflict waged between 2 equally legitimate claimants who could neither defeat each other nor agree to stop fighting. When Henry of Anjou, the son of Empress Matilda, and Geoffrey of Anjou, came to the English throne in 1154 following the death of King Stephen, he inherited not simply a kingdom, but a salvage operation of extraordinary complexity. He was 21 years old. He possessed territories in France that exceeded in extent and wealth the English kingdom itself, controlling not only Anjou and Normandy, but, through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152, the vast and culturally sophisticated Duchy of Aquitaine in the southwest. The combined territories that Henry II governed at the height of his power stretched from the border with Scotland in the north to the Pyrenees in the south, an assemblage of lands so extensive that later historians would give it the retrospective name of the Angevin Empire, though it was never administered as a single coherent political unit, and Henry himself would never have used such terminology to describe what he governed. What Henry II built during the first 2 decades of his reign was genuinely extraordinary. He restored the mechanisms of royal administration that the anarchy had destroyed. He reformed the legal system in ways that would shape English law for centuries, establishing the common law traditions through the expansion of royal courts and the development of writs and juries that extended royal justice into areas that had previously been governed only by local, custom, or baronial authority. He reclaimed castles that had been seized by barons during the Civil War period. He reasserted royal control over the church, a project that would ultimately destroy his friendship with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and produce one of the most catastrophic political crises of his reign. He conducted military campaigns in Wales, Ireland, and Scotland that extended the reach of English royal authority beyond the borders of England itself. By any external measure, Henry II was a ruler of exceptional capability, energy, and administrative intelligence. And yet the tragedy of Henry II's reign was already being prepared from the moment his sons began to reach maturity. The mechanism of that tragedy was built into the very structure of his territorial inheritance and the dynastic expectations it generated. Henry had 4 sons who survived to adulthood. Henry, known as the Young King, born in 1155, Richard, born in 1157, Geoffrey, born in 1158, and John, born in 1166. Each of these sons was, by the conventions of the time, entitled to expect a meaningful territorial inheritance from their father. Each of them watched as their father, now in middle age and showing no signs of relinquishing any significant portion of his power, continued to govern his vast assemblage of territories with the same relentless personal control he had exercised from the beginning of his reign. The catastrophe that resulted was not simply a matter of impatient sons chafing against a long-lived father. It was the product of specific decisions that Henry II made about how to manage his territorial inheritance and the expectations of his heirs. In 1170, Henry had his eldest son, the young Henry, crowned as co-king of England in a ceremony intended to secure the succession. This act created a king without a kingdom, a crowned heir who possessed the title of royal authority, but none of its substance. The young king was given no territory to govern, no revenues of his own, no administrative responsibilities that might have channeled his energy and ambition into constructive activity. Richard continued to govern Aquitaine under arrangements that gave him real practical power in that duchy, but no clear path to the English succession. Geoffrey received Brittany through his marriage to the heiress Constance, but Brittany was a peripheral territory whose value was limited compared to the great prizes of England and Normandy. John, whom Henry had taken to calling Lackland because there was no territory remaining to assign him, existed in a kind of constitutional limbo, acknowledged as a son who would receive something, but with no clear definition of what. The terms of the reconciliation that followed the failed revolt of 1173 and 1174 established a precedent that Henry II would repeat with terrible consistency throughout the remainder of his reign. He forgave his sons. He restored them to their former positions without meaningful punishment. He made limited promises about greater autonomy and larger territorial allocations that he never seriously intended to honor. And he changed nothing fundamental about the structural arrangements that had produced the rebellion in the first place. The young king remained a crowned king without territory or administrative authority. Richard continued to govern Aquitaine under arrangements that gave him real practical power in that duchy, but no clear path to the English succession that would satisfy his ambitions. Geoffrey received Brittany through his marriage to the heiress Constance, but Brittany was a peripheral territory whose value was limited compared to the great prizes of England and Normandy. John, the youngest, whom Henry had taken to calling Lackland because there was no territory remaining to assign him, existed in a kind of constitutional limbo, acknowledged as a son who would receive something, but with no clear definition of what that something might be. The Second Great Rebellion came in 1183, and it came from the direction Henry II had perhaps least expected or most feared to acknowledge. The young king, still crowned but still propertyless, still maintained at his father's court with an allowance that he consistently found insufficient for the household and retinue he considered appropriate to his royal dignity, launched another revolt. This time the conflict was primarily focused in Aquitaine, where the young king allied himself with the discontented barons of that duchy against his brother Richard, who was governing Aquitaine with a firmness that its nobility found oppressive. The war in Aquitaine in 1183 had elements that the earlier rebellion had lacked: brothers fighting directly against brothers, not simply sons coordinating against a father. The young king and Geoffrey were raiding the territories of Richard, while Henry II attempted to mediate a conflict that had now taken on dimensions that transcended the simple question of inheritance and had become a matter of personality, rivalry, and mutual destruction among siblings who had grown up knowing that the territorial arrangements of their dynasty guaranteed that one of them would gain more than the others. The rebellion of 1183 ended not through military resolution, but through the intervention of mortality. The young king died in June of 1183, at the age of 28, from a fever contracted during the campaign in Aquitaine. His death, which was preceded by a deathbed reconciliation with his father that Henry II reportedly found genuinely moving, removed the most immediate dynastic crisis by eliminating the one son who held a royal title without the substantive power to match it, but it created new crises in the same moment that it resolved the old one. Henry II, rather than allowing Richard, now the eldest surviving son, to inherit the young king's designated position as heir to England and Normandy, began moving in a direction that suggested he intended to redirect the succession toward his youngest and most favoured son, John. He pressed Richard to surrender Aquitaine so that John might receive it. He gave John what should have been Richard's position at the centre of the English succession, without acknowledging that he was doing so. Richard, who understood perfectly what his father was doing, refused to surrender Aquitaine and made clear that he regarded his father's actions as a declaration of intent that would require a response. Geoffrey of Brittany died in 1186, killed not in battle against his father or brothers but in a tournament accident in Paris, where he had been cultivating a relationship with King Philip II of France that had clear strategic implications. Geoffrey was 30 years old when he died, leaving behind a pregnant wife, a young daughter, and a history of political scheming that had established him as perhaps the most intellectually devious of Henry II's sons. His death simplified the immediate dynastic mathematics by removing one potential claimant, but it did not simplify the underlying structural problem. Richard still stood on one side of his father's intentions, John stood on the other, and both of them understood that Henry's choices in the years remaining to him would determine which of them inherited the empire he had spent his reign constructing. Henry II died on the 6th of July, 1189, at the castle of Chinon in Anjou, 2 days after his submission to Philip and Richard. The contemporary sources describe a man who had lost the will to live, who turned his face to the wall after learning of John's betrayal, and expired within 48 hours of the news reaching him. Whether this represents accurate historical reportage or the elaboration of a morally satisfying narrative is difficult to determine at this distance from the events. What is certain is that Henry II died having watched 3 of his 4 sons rebel against him at various points, having spent the last decades of his reign in a perpetual state of dynastic crisis that he had himself engineered through his refusal to adequately provide for his heirs while they remained capable of independent action. The dynasty he had built was intact, the territories were whole, the administrative machinery he had created continued to function. But the emotional and political capital that might have allowed the Plantagenet line to perpetuate itself through cooperative succession had been systematically consumed by a pattern of behaviour that would repeat itself with disturbing fidelity through the generations that followed. Richard I, who became king at the age of 31 in the summer of 1189, was in many respects everything that medieval kingship was supposed to produce. His physical courage was unquestioned by contemporaries on all sides, including his enemies. His military capability, which would be demonstrated with extraordinary force during the Third Crusade, placed him among the most effective commanders of his era. His administrative instincts, though less celebrated than his martial achievements, were genuine. He understood how to govern through delegation and how to construct the financial and logistical frameworks that sustained extended military operations. He was also, in terms of the dynastic narrative that concerns us here, a king who had been shaped by betrayal and who carried its lessons into his own conduct in ways that would both protect and ultimately damage the dynasty he now led. Richard's first significant act in relation to his surviving brother was instructive. John, whose betrayal of their father in the final months of Henry's reign had contributed directly to Henry's death, might reasonably have expected that Richard would respond to this act of treachery with the severity it warranted. Richard did not. He forgave John almost immediately and proceeded to provide him with a territorial settlement of considerable generosity, granting him the counties of Morton, Gloucester, Derby, Devon, Cornwall, and Lancaster, along with the castle of Marlborough and other English holdings, and promising him the hand of Isabel of Gloucester, the heiress to one of the most valuable noble estates in England. The rationale for this generosity was partly strategic. Richard was about to spend years away from England on crusade and needed a domestic arrangement that would minimize the risk of rebellion in his absence, and partly temperamental, reflecting Richard's tendency toward dramatic gestures of both anger and forgiveness that characterized his emotional life. The arrangement Richard made for England's governance during his absence demonstrated both his organizational capacity and the limitations of his understanding of John's character. He He appointed experienced and loyal administrators to manage English affairs, with William Longchamp, the Bishop of Ely, as Chief Justiciar. He took measures to limit John's effective power by requiring him to stay out of England for 3 years. But he also provided John with the resources and the territorial base that would make those restrictions difficult to enforce if John chose to challenge them. And John was precisely the kind of man who would do so the moment the enforcement mechanism, Richard's physical presence, was removed to a sufficient distance. The crisis that erupted during the years 1191 and 1192 demonstrated the predictive accuracy of every concern that had been expressed about John's reliability. He allied himself with Philip of France and with English barons who resented Longchamp's administration, working systematically to undermine Longchamp's authority and to create political conditions that would make it difficult for Richard, if he failed to return, to re-establish control. When news reached England in the early months of 1193 that Richard had been captured by Duke Leopold of Austria on his return from the Holy Land and was being held by the Holy Roman Emperor, John moved with the urgency of a man who understood that this was the opportunity he had been constructing for 2 years. He performed homage to Philip for the Plantagenet continental territories and agreed to arrangements that, if implemented, would have delivered the Angevin inheritance to Philip's control. What saved the English kingdom from the consequences of John's treachery in 1193 was not Richard's rescue that took until February of 1194, but the loyalty of the English administrative and ecclesiastical establishment to the institution of Plantagenet kingship, combined with the considerable ransom-raising capacity of an English church and nobility who understood that their own prosperity depended on the maintenance of effective royal government. The ransom demanded for Richard's release, 100,000 marks of silver, represented approximately twice the annual revenue of the English crown, and the effort to raise it required an administrative mobilization of extraordinary scope that touched every level of English society. That the ransom was ultimately raised, and that Richard was released and returned to England in the spring of 1194, represented one of the most remarkable administrative achievements of the medieval English state. It also represented a verdict on John's conspiracy. When Richard arrived in England, John's support evaporated with the speed that characterizes support built on the expectation of permanent absence. Richard, in a scene that contemporaries found as characteristic as it was inexplicable, forgave John once again. Richard I died on the 6th of April, 1199, from a crossbow bolt wound sustained during a minor siege at the castle of Chalus-Chabrol in the Limousin, a siege he had undertaken for reasons that the sources describe with varying degrees of plausibility. He was 41 years old. His death without legitimate children transformed John, who had spent the previous decade alternating between rebellion and reconciliation with his brother, from a troublesome younger sibling into the heir to the entire Plantagenet inheritance. The other claimant to the throne was Arthur of Brittany, the posthumous son of Geoffrey, the third of Henry II's sons to reach maturity, who was 12 years old at the time of Richard's death, and whose claim through his father gave him a technically stronger right to the succession than John's claim as a younger son. The question of whether seniority of generation, which favoured Arthur, or proximity of degree, which favoured John as Richard's brother rather than his nephew, should determine the succession, was one that different parts of the Plantagenet inheritance answered differently. England and Normandy accepted John. Anjou, Maine, and Touraine initially supported Arthur. John's kingship, which lasted from 1199 to 1216, represents in many respects the concentrated distillation of everything that the Plantagenet pattern of familial betrayal had produced. He was a king who had been formed by watching his father betray the expectations of his elder brothers, who had himself betrayed his father and his brother with a consistency that spoke to something more than mere opportunism, and who now occupied the position of authority whose responsibilities he had spent his entire adult life attempting to undermine from below. His reign began with the most consequential act of dynastic self-destruction since Henry II's treatment of Thomas Becket, the disappearance and presumed murder of his nephew Arthur of Brittany. Arthur was captured by John's forces at the Battle of Mirabeau in August of 1202, at the age of 15. He was held prisoner thereafter, initially at Falaise and then at Rouen. In the spring of 1203, he disappeared from the historical record entirely. The most widely credited contemporary accounts suggest that John killed him personally, or had him killed, in a fit of rage or strategic calculation at Rouen Castle, and that his body was thrown into the Seine. The consequences of Arthur's disappearance extended far beyond the immediate dynastic question. It destroyed John's credibility with the Norman and Angevin nobility at the precise moment when he needed their loyalty to resist the military pressure Philip II of France was bringing to bear on the continental territories. The Norman barons, many of whom had personal connections to Arthur, or who held lands in both England and France, and needed to calculate their allegiances carefully, drew the obvious conclusion from the evidence available to them and began to adjust their political calculations accordingly. By the spring of 1204, Normandy had fallen to Philip II of France. The duchy that William the Conqueror had brought to England through conquest in 1066 was gone. The loss was not primarily military, it was primarily political, the product of John's inability to retain the loyalty of the Norman nobility, which was itself the product of the credible suspicion that he had murdered his nephew in captivity. The crisis that produced Magna Carta in June of 1215 was in this sense not merely a constitutional struggle between royal, prerogative and baronial rights, though it was certainly that. It was also the specific consequence of John's failure to hold the loyalty of the English baronage through the combination of military success and political credibility that medieval kingship required. John had attempted to recover Normandy and the lost continental territories through an ambitious military strategy that culminated in the Battle of Bouvines in July of 1214, where Philip II of France decisively defeated John's German allies and ended any realistic prospect of reconquest. John returned to England in the autumn of 1214, militarily defeated, financially exhausted from the extraordinary taxation he had imposed to fund the continental campaign, and politically isolated from the baronage whose support he needed, but whose grievances he had allowed to accumulate over more than a decade of arbitrary government. The rebellion that produced Magna Carta had been building since at least 1212, and it represented the final breakdown of the political relationship between John and the English baronage. What is significant about Magna Carta for the purposes of the dynastic narrative is not its constitutional content, which is extensively documented and analysed elsewhere, but what it reveals about the degree to which John's own conduct had eroded the institutional foundations of Plantagenet kingship. The barons who forced Magna Carta upon John in June of 1215 were not attempting to destroy the monarchy. They were attempting to constrain a specific king whose behaviour had made it impossible to function within the existing arrangements of royal government. The document they produced was in large part a catalogue of the specific abuses they had experienced or feared under John's rule: arbitrary imprisonment, excessive scutage, manipulation of inheritance procedures, interference with the church. Many of these abuses had precedents in earlier reigns. What made them intolerable under John was the absence of the counterweights that had made them tolerable before: the military success that justified heavy taxation, the personal charisma that sustained loyalty through difficult periods, the basic reliability of royal promises that allowed political relationships to function. John's response to Magna Carta was entirely consistent with his character as it had been revealed across 3 decades of political activity. He accepted the document in June of 1215, obtained a papal annulment of it in August of 1215, and spent the subsequent months preparing for a military campaign to suppress the baronial rebellion by force, a campaign that required him to invite a French invasion of England as a counterbalancing factor in the negotiations, an act of political self-destruction whose consequences extended well beyond his own reign. Louis, the son of Philip II of France, crossed to England in the spring of 1216 with a substantial military force at the invitation of the rebel barons, and by the summer of 1216 controlled a significant portion of England, including London. John, in the autumn of 1216, fell ill during a campaign in the east of England and died on the 18th or 19th of October of that year, at the age of approximately 49, from dysentery. He died with his kingdom in a state of active civil war, his continental inheritance permanently lost, his relationship with the church only recently restored after years of interdict, and his reputation so thoroughly destroyed that historians have found it difficult to rehabilitate him in any significant degree in the 7 centuries since his death. The succession passed to his 9-year-old son, Henry III, under circumstances that might have seemed to guarantee the extinction of Plantagenet power. The French Prince Louis controlled London and much of eastern England. The rebel barons who had invited him constituted a substantial portion of the English nobility, and the royal treasury was exhausted. What saved the Plantagenet line was the loyalty and capability of William Marshal, the Earl of Pembroke, the greatest knight of his era, who agreed to serve as regent for the young king. Marshal's military victory at the Battle of Lincoln in May of 1217 and the naval victory at Sandwich in August of 1217 allowed the Treaty of Kingston in September of 1217 to end the Civil War and remove Louis from England. The reign of Henry III, which lasted from 1216 to 1272 and stands as the longest reign of any Plantagenet monarch, represents a different register of dynastic self-destruction from the explosive familial betrayals that had characterized the reigns of his father and grandfather. He was, in the contemporary understanding of those who governed alongside him, a man of genuine personal piety, considerable aesthetic sensibility, and deep loyalty to those he loved, a description that encompasses his Savoyard and Lusignan relatives, whose importation into English political life became one of the defining controversies of his reign. The problem with Henry III was not that he betrayed his blood, but that he elevated it so selectively and so conspicuously that the English baronage concluded, with increasing force as the decades passed, that the English kingdom was being systematically exploited in the interests of a dynasty that felt no particular obligation to its English institutional foundations. Henry III's marriage to Eleanor of Provence in 1236 brought into English court life a network of Provençal and Savoyard relatives whose influence over the king proved deeply resented by the established English baronage. The Queen's uncles, particularly Peter of Savoy and Boniface of Savoy, who became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1241, received lands, offices, and revenues from English sources that the baronage regarded as properly belonging to English beneficiaries. This grievance, real as it was, might have remained manageable if Henry had not compounded it by also importing the relatives of his mother, Isabella of Angoulême, who had remarried after John's death and produced a second family with Hugh de Lusignan in France. Henry's Lusignan half-brothers, particularly Hugh de Lusignan and Aymer de Valence, arrived in England in the 1240s and received grants of land and office that confirmed the baronage's worst suspicions about Henry's priorities. The accumulation of foreign influence at the English court was not simply an aesthetic or cultural grievance. It represented, from the baronage's perspective, the redirection of English resources away from English beneficiaries toward a network of foreign kinsmen who felt no particular obligation to the English kingdom or its institutions. The crisis that culminated in the provisions of Oxford in 1258 and subsequently in the Second Barons' War of 1264 to 1267 bears comparison with the crisis that had produced Magna Carta under John, but with significant differences that reveal how the character of Plantagenet dynastic failure evolved across the generations. John's crisis had been produced by specific, identifiable abuses of royal power by a king whose personal conduct was widely understood to be extraordinarily arbitrary and potentially violent. Henry III's crisis was produced by something more diffuse and, in some respects, more interesting, a sustained pattern of political misjudgment that suggested not personal malice, but a fundamental misunderstanding of the contractual basis of medieval English kingship. Henry appears to have genuinely believed that his royal authority entitled him to govern England in the interests of whoever he chose to favour, including his foreign relatives, and that the baronage had no legitimate basis for constraining this authority so long as he operated within the broad framework of law. The baronage, with equal genuineness, believed that the king's authority was conditional on its exercise in the interests of the English kingdom rather than the personal kinship network of the king. Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester, who led the baronial opposition to Henry III in the 1260s, and who was in his own person a representative of the foreign importation that had become the central baronial grievance, since he was himself a Frenchman who had come to England and married the king's sister, provides one of the most complex figures in the entire Plantagenet narrative. De Montfort had been Henry's ally, his friend, and his brother-in-law before becoming his most dangerous political opponent. The marriage between de Montfort and Henry's sister Eleanor in 1238, conducted secretly and apparently without the baronial council's knowledge, had itself been an act that had deeply offended the baronage, who regarded it as precisely the kind of unilateral royal decision that bypassed the consultation processes they considered essential. De Montfort's transformation from royal favourite to revolutionary opponent of the crown was produced by a specific set of grievances relating to his governance of Gascony in the 1240s, which Henry had tried to prosecute judicially in a way that de Montfort regarded as a profound personal betrayal, and by his intellectual and personal evolution toward a more consistent position on the constitutional questions that the struggle with Henry had raised. The Battle of Lewes in May of 1264, at which de Montfort's forces captured both Henry III and his son and heir, the future Edward I, represented the moment at which the baronial revolution came closest to achieving a permanent transformation of English royal government. The subsequent Parliament of 1265, which de Montfort summoned, and which is sometimes identified as a formative event in the development of the English parliamentary tradition, because it included representatives of the towns, as well as the nobility and clergy, demonstrated that de Montfort had a coherent vision of a reformed English constitutional order. What ended this vision was not its intellectual inadequacy, but the military skill of the young Lord Edward, who escaped from custody in May of 1265, gathered a royalist army with remarkable speed, and defeated and killed de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham in August of 1265. De Montfort was killed, his body was mutilated. The revolution was over. What is significant about Edward I, in the context of the Plantagenet dynastic narrative, is not primarily his treatment of his own family, which was by the standards of his predecessors relatively stable, but the decisions he made about the succession that would shape the catastrophe of his son's reign. Edward I had a large family by his first wife, Eleanor of Castile, who died in 1190 and subsequently remarried Margaret of France in 1299. His son and heir, the future Edward II, was born in April of 1284, the fourth son of Edward and Eleanor, who became heir to the throne only because his three elder brothers all died in childhood. The prince, who would become Edward II, was therefore not prepared from birth for the responsibilities of kingship in the way that firstborn heirs might be groomed and shaped by specific educational and political experiences. He grew to adulthood in the shadow of a father whose standards of kingship were among the most demanding in English history, and the comparison between father and son that contemporaries made from the earliest years of Edward II's reign was one that no one could have been expected to survive with equanimity. The relationship between Edward I and his heir, the prince who would become Edward II, deteriorated in the final years of the old king's reign in ways that foreshadowed the catastrophes to come. The central object of contention was Piers Gaveston, a young Gascon nobleman who had come into the prince's household and who had formed with him a bond of personal attachment that Edward I viewed with sufficient alarm that he expelled Gaveston from England in 1307 and threatened to disinherit his son if he made any unauthorized grants to Gaveston during his banishment. The nature of the relationship between Edward II and Gaveston has been debated by historians since the 14th century. Contemporary sources describe it in terms that range from the language of intense friendship and political alliance to explicit suggestion of sexual attachment. What is certain is that the relationship had a quality that those who observed it, including Edward's own father, regarded as incompatible with the proper conduct of royal government, and that Edward II's defence of Gaveston and his refusal to distance himself from him would dominate the opening years of his reign and ultimately destroy both Gaveston and, in the longer run, Edward himself. Edward I died in July of 1307 at Berg, by Sands in Cumberland, while on campaign in Scotland, still pursuing the subjugation of a kingdom whose resistance under Robert Bruce had proven more durable than he had expected. He was 68 years old, and his death removed from the scene the one figure whose authority and military capability had kept the centrifugal forces of English baronial politics in sufficient check to maintain a functioning royal government. Edward II recalled Gaveston from exile within weeks of his father's death, created him Earl of Cornwall, and arranged for him to govern England in his absence, while he travelled to France for his marriage to Isabella, daughter of King Philip IV of France. The creation of Gaveston as Earl of Cornwall, one of the most prestigious titles in the English nobility, and one traditionally reserved for members of the royal family, was an act of deliberate provocation toward the English baronage at a moment when the new king's political capital was at its most limited and most needed. The cycle of baronial opposition, royal capitulation, and royal recovery that structured the politics of Edward II's reign from 1308 to 1322 has a particular quality of exhausted repetition that distinguishes it from the more explosive crises of earlier Plantagenet reigns. The barons demanded Gaveston's exile in 1308, and Edward complied. Gaveston returned from exile. The barons demanded his exile again in 1310, and the ordinances of 1311, which the barons forced upon Edward as the price of military support for his Scottish campaign, required not only Gaveston's permanent exile, but also a broad range of constitutional constraints on royal power that echoed the provisions of Oxford imposed on Henry III. Edward accepted the ordinances and then proceeded to violate them almost immediately. Gaveston returned yet again. In 1312, the barons, led by the king's cousin Thomas of Lancaster and the Earl of Pembroke, Aymer de Valence, seized Gaveston in the north of England. He was executed in June of 1312 on Blacklow Hill by men in the service of the Earl of Warwick, in an act that fell somewhere between judicial murder and summary execution. Gaveston's death did not resolve the political crisis of Edward II's reign. It deepened it by demonstrating that the king's closest associate could be seized and killed by baronial opponents without effective royal response, and by generating in Edward a grief and rage that would colour every subsequent political relationship of his reign. The decade following Gaveston's death saw Edward II attempting to rebuild his political position through a new set of personal favourites, the Despensers, father and son, whose rapacious acquisition of lands and offices exceeded even Gaveston's accumulation of royal favour in its scope and its offensiveness to the established baronage. Hugh Despenser, the younger, who became Edward's closest adviser and possibly his lover in the years following Gaveston's death, was a man of considerably greater political intelligence than Gaveston had been, and he used that intelligence primarily to construct a position of personal power that stripped the Marcher lords and the general nobility of lands and revenues through a combination of legal manipulation, royal patronage, and outright intimidation. The crisis of 1321 and 1322 produced the final confrontation between Edward II and his baronial opponents in the form of a civil war that Edward, for once, won decisively. The contrariants, as the barons who had risen against the Despensers were known, were defeated at the Battle of Boroughbridge in March of 1322. Thomas of Lancaster, Edward's cousin and the leading magnate of the opposition throughout his reign, was captured, tried, and executed at Pontefract in March of 1322, a reversal of political fortunes so complete that it briefly seemed to signal the rehabilitation of royal authority in England. Edward spent the years from 1322 to 1326 governing England with the Despensers as his principal instruments of power, in a manner that combined genuine administrative capability with systematic extortion of those whom the king or his favourites wished to punish or exploit. The instrument of Edward II's destruction was not baronial opposition but his own queen, Isabella of France, who in 1217 had married him as a 12-year-old bride and who had spent the subsequent years in a position of growing alienation from a husband who preferred the company of his favourites to hers. Isabella's relationship with Roger Mortimer, the greatest of the Marcher lords, which began during her residence in France in 1225 and 1326, where she had been sent to negotiate a peace settlement over disputed territories, represented the transformation of personal grievance into political program, with a clarity that contemporary observers found both shocking and entirely comprehensible. Mortimer was a man who had escaped from the Tower of London in 1323, one of only a handful of people in the medieval period to manage this feat, and who had been building his position in France while gathering support for an invasion of England that would remove the Despensers and, if necessary, Edward himself. The invasion of September 1326, launched from the Low Countries with a small force but rapidly attracting supporters as it moved through England, demonstrated the degree to which Edward II had exhausted his political credit with every significant section of English political society. The Despensers were captured and executed with the particular savagery that medieval justice reserved for those guilty of treason against the crown and betrayal of the kingdom. Hugh Despenser the Elder was hanged at Bristol in October of 1326. Hugh Despenser the Younger was captured, subjected to a degradation ritual that stripped him of his heraldic symbols, and then hanged, drawn, and beheaded at Hereford in November of 1326. Edward II was captured in Wales, taken into custody, and imprisoned at Kenilworth Castle and subsequently at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. In January of 1327, a parliament assembled under Isabella's and Mortimer's control voted to depose Edward II and replace him with his 14-year-old son, who became Edward III. Edward II formally abdicated, reportedly weeping throughout the ceremony. The fate of the deposed king represents one of the darkest moments in Plantagenet dynastic history. Edward II died at Berkeley Castle in September of 1327, officially from natural causes, though the contemporary chronicle tradition and most subsequent historical opinion attributes his death to deliberate murder. The specific method of murder described in the chronicle tradition, which involves a heated implement, cannot be verified from the physical evidence that survives, and some historians have argued for the possibility that Edward survived and escaped, living out his remaining years in continental exile. The weight of the evidence, such as it is, supports the conclusion that he was killed at Berkeley Castle on approximately the 21st of September of 1327 by agents of Roger Mortimer, or acting on instructions that originated with Mortimer. Whether Isabella was aware of or participated in the decision to kill her husband remains one of the genuinely unresolvable questions of medieval English history. The son, who had been used to depose his father, Edward III, was himself a victim of a form of dynastic betrayal in the opening years of his reign, though the perpetrators were his mother and her lover rather than any external force. For the 3 years from 1327 to 1330, England was governed, in effect, by Isabella and Mortimer, nominally in the name of the young king, but actually in the service of Mortimer's personal aggrandizement, which consumed the resources and the political capital of the English crown, with a thoroughness that recalled the worst excesses of John's and Henry III's favourites. Mortimer's execution of Edmund, Earl of Kent, Edward's uncle, in 1330, on the basis of a conspiracy charge that most contemporaries regarded as fabricated, was the act that finally drove the young king to take the action that he had been preparing for some time. In October of 1330, Edward III organised a coup at Nottingham Castle that arrested Mortimer and his associates, and in November of 1330, Mortimer was tried and executed at Tyburn. Isabella was allowed to live in a form of comfortable but permanent retirement until her death in 1358. Edward III, at 18 years old, had retrieved the authority that the Plantagenet crown was supposed to represent, and he would go on to demonstrate over the subsequent 4 decades that the dynasty was capable of producing kings who embodied the medieval ideals of martial excellence, political skill, and personal magnificence with a consistency that temporarily obscured the dynastic fault lines running beneath the surface. The reign of Edward III from 1330 to 1377, provides the most sustained period of Plantagenet external achievement in the dynasty's entire history, and it is therefore the period that most powerfully illustrates the paradox at its heart. The greater the external success, the more powerful the internal contradictions that success generated. Edward III's military campaigns in France produced victories at Sluys in 1340, Crécy in 1346, and Poitiers in 1356, the last won by his son, the Black Prince, and resulting in the capture of the French king, John II. The Treaty of Bretagne in 1360 appeared to achieve a territorial settlement so favourable that contemporaries wondered whether the ambitions that had driven English kings toward the French succession might finally have been satisfied. Edward III's reign also demonstrated the Plantagenet capacity for institutional creativity at its most impressive. The development of Parliament during this period, with the consolidation of its bicameral structure and the establishment of the Commons as a regular participant in the processes of royal taxation, reflected the degree to which the constitutional struggles of the previous reigns had produced durable institutional innovations. The Order of the Garter, founded in 1348, provided a framework for the expression of chivalric values and political loyalty that served simultaneously as a cultural institution and a mechanism for binding the leading members of the English nobility to the crown through rituals of mutual obligation. The legal reforms of Edward's reign, building on the foundations laid by his grandfather, continued the development of common law institutions that had been one of the defining achievements of the dynasty since Henry II. But the dynastic configuration that Edward III created through his extraordinary fecundity and the decisions he made about the territorial and political provision for his numerous sons contained within it the seeds of everything that would follow in the subsequent century. Edward and his queen, Philippa of Hainault, had 13 children who survived infancy, of whom 5 sons reached maturity. Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, born 1330. Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, born 1338. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, born 1340. Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, born 1341. And Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, born 1355. Each of these sons was provided with a ducal title and a territorial base appropriate to his royal lineage. Each of them produced children, who in turn produced children, creating a Plantagenet dynastic network of increasing genealogical complexity from which competing claims to the throne could be derived with equal facility by any lawyer competent in the technicalities of descent and inheritance. The endowment of these sons, which was motivated by Edward's genuine devotion to his family and his sense that the royal dignity required appropriate territorial expressions, created a structural problem that would become visible only after his death, but whose outlines were already apparent to those who thought carefully about dynastic mathematics. The more sons a king had, the more branches of the royal family there were. The more branches there were, the more potential claimants there would be in the next generation and the generation after that. The more potential claimants there were, the more opportunities there were for the genealogical claims of different lines to conflict, and the more directly those lines were descended from royal blood, the more credible those conflicting claims would be. Edward III was, in short, extraordinarily successful at producing the human raw material for the civil war that would eventually consume the dynasty. He did so not through malice or stupidity, but through the entirely natural expression of dynastic ambition in a form that its immediate consequences made entirely admirable. The catastrophe that immediately followed Edward III's reign was produced by a specific failure of succession rather than by the broader structural problem of too many royal branches, though the broader problem would become determinative in the generation after. Edward III's eldest son, the Black Prince, died of illness in June of 1376, nearly a year before his father, leaving as his heir his 10-year-old son Richard, who became Richard II when Edward III died in June of 1377. The England that Richard II inherited was one that had already been substantially destabilized by the combined effects of the Black Death, which had killed somewhere between a third and a half of the English population between 1348 and 1350, and the social and economic disruptions that followed from that catastrophic mortality event. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which produced the most dramatic popular uprising in English medieval history and brought the rebel leader Wat Tyler to within speaking distance of the young king at Smithfield, demonstrated the degree to which the social foundations of medieval English governance had been shaken by the demographic catastrophe of the Plague Years. Richard II's response to the Peasants' Revolt was, in its immediate tactical dimension, one of the most successful moments of his reign. The 14-year-old king rode out to meet the rebels at Smithfield after Tyler's death, proclaimed himself their leader, and dispersed them with promises of reforms that he had no intention of keeping. It was exactly the kind of dramatic personal gesture that Richard would prove capable of producing throughout his reign, a gesture that substituted theatrical authority for the sustained political engagement that effective governance actually required. Richard II was capable, intelligent, and deeply interested in art, architecture, and culture in ways that make him one of the most intellectually interesting of the Plantagenet monarchs. He was also capable of a paranoid intensity in his treatment of political opponents, a conviction of royal divinity and absolute authority, and an emotional volatility that his own supporters found destabilizing and his opponents found dangerous. The politics of Richard II's reign, from 1387 to 1399, trace the most clearly defined arc of any period in Plantagenet dynastic history. A king who possessed genuine capabilities, but who systematically alienated every significant group in English political society through a combination of genuine constitutional ambition and personal vindictiveness that made his eventual deposition not merely possible but, in retrospect, inevitable. The crisis of 1386 and 1387, produced by Richard's dependence on a small group of personal favourites, Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford, and the Chancellor Michael de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, and his attempt to govern England without the parliamentary consent that constitutional convention required, produced the Lords Appellant, a group of magnates led by the king's uncle Thomas of Gloucester and including his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, Earl of Derby, who challenged the king's government and forced the submission of his favourites. The merciless Parliament of 1388, so named for the severity of the punishments it imposed on Richard's allies, executed or drove into exile most of the men Richard had relied on in the preceding years. Robert de Vere, who had fled to France, never returned. Michael de la Pole died in exile. Richard himself was temporarily at the mercy of the Lords Appellant, who briefly contemplated his deposition before concluding that the political risks of that step outweighed the advantages. The years from 1389 to 1397, when Richard declared himself of full age and capacity and began to resume direct personal control of government, have traditionally been characterized as a period of relative moderation in which Richard appeared to have learnt something from the experience of 1387 and 1388. He worked with his council rather than against it. He maintained reasonable relationships with the major magnates. He pursued a peace settlement with France that, however unpopular with the war party in England, reflected a realistic assessment of English military and financial capacity. This period of apparent moderation was, however, a preparation rather than a resolution. Richard II had not abandoned his constitutional ambitions or his desire to revenge himself on those who had humiliated him in 1387 and 1388. He had simply deferred their pursuit until he was in a sufficiently strong position to act on them without generating the kind of organized baronial opposition that had constrained him previously. The events of 1397 made clear what he had been building toward. In July of 1397, Richard suddenly arrested 3 of the lords, Appellant the Duke of Gloucester, the Earl of Arundel, and the Earl of Warwick. Arundel was tried and executed. Warwick was tried and exiled. Gloucester, Richard's uncle, died in custody at Calais in September of 1397, almost certainly murdered on Richard's orders, an act that reproduced with disturbing fidelity the fate of Arthur of Brittany under King John nearly 2 centuries earlier. The The murder of Gloucester and the judicial proceedings against Arundel and Warwick in 1397 were not the acts of a king who had lost his political judgment in a fit of rage. They were carefully prepared, deliberately executed, and systematically followed up with a programme of constitutional innovation that Richard pursued through Parliament in the sessions of 1397 and 1398, extracting from Parliament a set of powers and prerogatives that made royal authority, in formal constitutional terms, more extensive than it had been since the early 13th century. Richard appeared, in the autumn and winter of 1397, to have achieved the project that had occupied his political ambitions since the crisis of his adolescence: the subordination of parliamentary authority to royal will, the punishment of those who had humiliated him, and the establishment of a kingship that could not be constrained by baronial opposition. What destroyed this apparent triumph was the decision Richard made in September of 1398, following a quarrel between Henry Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, that Richard used as an opportunity to exile both men. Mowbray was exiled for life. Bolingbroke, whose relationship with Richard had been complicated since 1387, he had been one of the Lords Appellant, but had subsequently moved to a more accommodating position toward the king, was exiled for 10 years, a punishment that was subsequently reduced to 6 by royal grace. But that still removed from England the man who was, since the death of Gloucester, the most powerful single magnate in the kingdom. Bolingbroke was Henry of Lancaster, the son of John of Gaunt, who was the most powerful of Edward III's surviving sons. He had inherited through his father the Duchy of Lancaster, the greatest single accumulation of noble wealth and political influence in England. Richard's decision to exile him was defensible in the narrow terms of the quarrel that had produced it, but catastrophic in terms of its political consequences, because it created an enemy who possessed the resources and the lineage to challenge the crown directly, and it created that enemy outside England, where he was beyond Richard's ability to constrain. John of Gaunt died in February of 1399. Richard II, rather than allowing Bolingbroke to return from exile to claim his father's vast inheritance as the law and custom of the time required, extended Bolingbroke's exile to life and seized the Lancastrian inheritance for the crown. This act, which violated the fundamental principles of noble inheritance that the entire English political class depended on for the security of their own estates, was greeted with an alarm that transcended partisan politics. If the king could seize the inheritance of the greatest noble in England on the grounds of a technical quarrel, no one's lands were secure. Richard had created not merely a powerful personal enemy, but a constitutional grievance that resonated with every landholder in England. Henry Bolingbroke landed in England in July of 1399 at Ravenspur in Yorkshire, while Richard II was in Ireland, conducting a military campaign whose timing, in retrospect, appears almost inexplicably ill-judged, given what his agents in England must have been telling him about the state of political opinion there. Bolingbroke had come, he declared, to reclaim his Lancastrian inheritance. Whether this claim accurately represented his intentions at the moment of landing, or whether the reclamation of his inheritance was always understood by him as a step toward the reclamation of the throne, is one of the enduring interpretive questions about the events of 1399. What is certain is that the English baronage, with a speed and unanimity that revealed the depth of their disillusionment with Richard's government, rallied to Bolingbroke with a unanimity that made his campaign less a military operation than a political procession. By the time Richard returned from Ireland in late July, the military situation was already beyond recovery. He was captured in Wales in August, brought to London, and imprisoned in the Tower. The formal deposition of Richard II in September of 1399 required constitutional innovation of a kind that would have long-term consequences for every subsequent claim to the English throne. Parliament assembled, and in a procedure of genuine novelty, Richard was declared to have abdicated or forfeited his right to the throne through a reading of 33 articles of misgovernment, a procedure that attempted to ground the removal of a king in the language of legal process rather than mere conquest. Bolingbroke then stepped forward and claimed the throne, not through any single clear principle of succession, but through a deliberately ambiguous formulation that combined conquest descent through his father's Lancastrian line from Henry III, and the consent of the estates of the realm, he became Henry IV. The new Lancastrian dynasty that he founded was, from its first moment, a kingship whose title was irreducibly contested in ways that its founder clearly understood, and that he spent the remainder of his reign attempting to manage through a combination of military force, political patronage, and the carefully maintained fiction that his succession had been legitimate and universally consensual. Richard II died at Pontefract Castle in February of 1400, officially from self-imposed starvation, following the failure of a plot to restore him to the throne, though later tradition would attribute his death to deliberate murder at Henry IV's direction. He was 33 years old. His death removed from the scene the figure who served as the living focus for every attempt to challenge Lancastrian legitimacy, but it could not remove from the genealogical record the fact that the deposition of 1399 had elevated a younger line over an older one in a way that the rules of inheritance, as they were then understood, did not unambiguously support. The claim that would most directly challenge the Lancastrian succession in the following generation was not based on Bolingbroke's Lancastrian descent from Edward III through John of Gaunt, who was Edward's third surviving son, but on the descent from Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, who was Edward's second surviving son, and therefore senior to Lancaster in the Plantagenet family tree. The representatives of this senior descent were the Mortimer family, Earls of March, and through them, the House of York, which would become relevant to the succession in ways that the events of 1399 had made inevitable by the choices made about which lines took precedence. Henry IV's reign, from 1399 to 1413, was consumed by the effort to maintain a throne whose legitimacy remained permanently contested by those with genealogical grounds to challenge it, and by those who had supported the Lancastrian succession in 1399, but who felt that their support had not been adequately recognised or rewarded. The rebellions of his reign were numerous: the attempted restoration of Richard II in 1400, the revolt of the Welsh under Owain Glyndwr, which began in 1400 and was not fully suppressed until approximately 1415, the Percy Rebellion of 1403, in which the powerful Percy family of Northumberland, who had been among Bolingbroke's most important supporters in 1399, rose against the king they had helped to create, the Scrope Rebellion of 1405, and a conspiracy involving Richard Scrope, the Archbishop of York, that resulted in Scrope's execution, a proceeding that shocked contemporaries because of the sacrilegious character of executing an archbishop without papal sanction. Henry IV spent the last years of his reign in declining health from a progressive illness that the sources describe with insufficient clinical precision to allow modern diagnosis, but which was clearly both serious and progressive. The practical management of royal government passed increasingly to his son, the Prince of Wales, and the tensions between father and son that characterized this period of shared governance were real, but relatively contained by the standards of Plantagenet generational conflict. The prince was more aggressive in his desire to pursue active military policy in France, and more accommodating towards sections of the English political community that had been marginalized under his father's administration. Henry IV died in March of 1413 at the age of 46, worn out by illness and the accumulated stress of a reign that had required the constant management of challenges that never fully resolved because the legitimacy question never fully resolved. He died having restored, however imperfectly, some of the authority that Lancastrian kingship required, but without having resolved the genealogical question whose irresolution would doom the dynasty that followed him. The military campaign in France that Henry V launched in 1415, and specifically the victory at Agincourt on the 25th of October 1415, in which an English force of several thousand soldiers defeated a French army estimated at several times that size, provided exactly the kind of spectacular validation that Henry's political strategy required. Agincourt became, almost immediately, the central example in a cultural narrative about English military virtue and royal excellence that made challenge to the Lancastrian king equivalent to challenge to England's providential destiny. The theological framework within which Henry interpreted his military success as divine vindication of a righteous cause was more than mere propaganda. It appears to have been genuinely believed by the king and by a significant portion of his contemporaries. Whether the cause was in fact righteous in the terms Henry claimed it to be was a question that the victory at Agincourt made temporarily irrelevant in English political discourse. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which recognized Henry V as heir to the French throne and regent of France during the reign of the incapacitated Charles VI, and which arranged for his marriage to Catherine of Valois, Charles's daughter, appeared to achieve for England a settlement of the French question that exceeded even the most optimistic projections of what a successful military campaign might produce. Henry had not merely won military victories in France. He had apparently secured for the English crown a permanent territorial and dynastic claim on the French kingdom that would make England the dominant power in northwestern Europe for the foreseeable future. The political achievement was extraordinary. Its durability was another matter entirely, and Henry V would not live to discover how durable it was, because he died in August of 1422 at Vincennes in France. At the age of 35, from dysentery contracted during the siege of Meaux, he had been king for 9 years. His son and heir, the future Henry VI, was 9 months old. The death of Henry V at 35 represents one of the most consequential single events in English medieval history, because it removed from the scene the one figure whose personal capabilities and political authority were holding together an arrangement, the dual monarchy of England and France, that was inherently unstable and that would require extraordinary sustained management to maintain. The infant Henry VI inherited a position of apparently extraordinary power and faced circumstances that would have challenged the most capable adult ruler in England's history. The regency government that was established to govern both England and France in his name was competent but divided, organized around the competing interests and personalities of his two uncles, John, Duke of Bedford, who governed France, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, who served as protector in England, and around the dominant political figure of Henry Beaufort, Cardinal Bishop of Winchester, who was Henry IV's illegitimate half-brother and whose wealth and political skill made him the most powerful single figure in English politics for the middle decades of the 15th century. The French War went badly almost immediately after Henry V's death, not because the military capacity of the English forces suddenly diminished, but because the political coherence that Henry had imposed on a fundamentally contradictory situation dissolved with him. The emergence of Joan of Arc in 1429, whatever its ultimate explanation, functioned as a catalyst for the French military recovery that gradually but irreversibly tilted the balance of the war against English control of the territories acquired under the Treaty of Troyes. By the time Henry VI began to exercise personal rule in the late 1430s, the political and military situation in France was already deteriorating in ways that would prove impossible to reverse. The Treaty of Arras in 1435, in which Philip the Good of Burgundy abandoned his English alliance and recognized the Valois king Charles VII as the legitimate king of France, was perhaps the single most consequential diplomatic event of the 15th century for English prospects on the continent. It removed the Burgundian military and economic support that had made English control of northern France sustainable and created conditions that made the ultimate loss of almost all English territory in France not merely possible but probable. Henry VI's personal rule, which he began to exercise in a meaningful sense from approximately 1437, confirmed within a few years the worst fears of those who had watched the Regency period with concern. He was a man of genuine personal piety, considerable literacy, and complete incompetence as a political ruler. He had no capacity for the sustained attention to administrative detail that effective medieval government required, no talent for managing the competing interests of his nobility, no ability to project the martial authority that the culture of medieval kingship demanded, and a tendency to confer his confidence on a small number of men whose monopolization of royal favor generated in the excluded nobility the same explosive resentment that favorites had always generated in Plantagenet history. The difference between Henry VI's favourites and those of earlier reigns was not one of kind, but of degree. The political damage was greater because the king was weaker, and the damage was therefore less contained and more structurally consequential. He was, in short, precisely the kind of king that 3 decades of contested Lancastrian rule had produced, shaped by a minority in which strong magnates had governed in his name, and emerging into personal rule without the political education that a more engaged royal household might have provided. Margaret of Anjou, who became Queen of England through her marriage to Henry VI in April of 1445, was a woman of exceptional intelligence, formidable personal will, and political determination that contrasted so sharply with her husband's passivity as to create a partnership that was simultaneously necessary for the survival of the Lancastrian regime and profoundly damaging to its legitimacy. Medieval political culture expected queens to be consorts rather than rulers, and a queen who managed political affairs with the directness and aggression that circumstances compelled Margaret to employ was bound to generate the kind of gendered political criticism that diminished the authority of everything she undertook. Her relationship with Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who became her closest political ally after Suffolk's murder in 1450, generated rumours of an intimacy beyond the merely political that were probably false but were politically devastating because they raised questions about the legitimacy of the son, Edward of Westminster, who was born in October of 1453. After Henry VI had already suffered the first of the mental collapses that would periodically incapacitate him throughout the remainder of his reign. The mental collapse of Henry VI, in August of 1453, represented the moment at which every structural problem in the Lancastrian regime became simultaneously acute. The king was catatonic, unable to communicate, incapable of recognizing his wife or acknowledging his newborn son. A council government operated in his name, with Richard, Duke of York, serving as protector from March of 1454 following the council's recognition that effective government required a defined executive authority. York was, through his father's line, the heir of Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, who was Edward III's 4th son, but through his mother's line he was the heir of Roger Mortimer, Earl of March, whose mother had been Philippa, daughter of Lionel of Antwerp, Edward III's 2nd son. This maternal descent gave York a claim to the English succession that was senior, in terms of the strict rules of primogeniture, as they applied to female inheritance, to the Lancastrian line. It was a claim that York had not previously pressed openly, but that the circumstances of Henry VI's incapacity were beginning to make increasingly relevant to practical politics. Henry VI recovered his sanity in December of 1454, and his recovery immediately ended York's protectorate and restored Somerset, whom York had imprisoned, to the council and to royal favour. The speed with which the political configuration changed upon Henry's recovery demonstrated the degree to which the entire structure of English political life in the 1450s was dependent on the physical and mental condition of a single, profoundly inadequate man. The First Battle of St. Albans in May of 1455, at which York and his allies, most notably Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, and his son Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, confronted and defeated the royal forces, killed Somerset, and took control of the king's person, marked the transition of the political conflict from constitutional dispute to armed confrontation. St. Albans was, by the standards of the civil wars that would follow, a small engagement, but it established that the resolution of the political crisis would require military force, and that the Plantagenet habit of resolving dynastic disputes through violence was asserting itself once again, this time in a form that would prove incomparably more destructive than anything the dynasty had previously generated. The Wars of the Roses, as the subsequent period of intermittent civil conflict from 1455 to 1485 would eventually be called, represent the final and most prolonged expression of the dynastic self-destruction that had been building in the Plantagenet line since the reign of Henry II. The conflict was not simply a dynastic quarrel about succession. It was the accumulated product of 3 centuries of decisions about family, inheritance, and political loyalty that had created a genealogical tangle so complex that any competent lawyer could construct a plausible claim to the throne from multiple Plantagenet lines, and any significant military force could provide the practical means of pressing such a claim. The more directly those lines were descended from royal blood, the more credible those conflicting claims would be. Edward III had been extraordinarily successful at producing the human raw material for civil war. He did so not through malice or stupidity, but through the entirely natural expression of dynastic ambition in a form that its immediate consequences made entirely admirable, and which its longer-term consequences made catastrophic. Richard, Duke of York, did not live to become king. He was killed at the Battle of Wakefield in December of 1460, ambushed by Lancastrian forces in a manner that suggested either gross military overconfidence or a failure of intelligence about the strength and disposition of the forces opposing him. His death, combined with the deaths at Wakefield of his second son Edmund, Earl of Rutland, and his ally Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, who was captured and executed after the battle, removed from the scene the man who had been the centre of the Yorkist political project and replaced him with his eldest son, Edward, who was 18 years old and possessed in greater measure than his father the personal magnetism, physical presence, and military instinct that the situation required. Within 3 months of Wakefield, Edward had won the Battle of Mortimer's Cross in Herefordshire in February of 1461, had received the Neville family's crucial military support under the Earl of Warwick, had entered London to a reception that demonstrated the degree to which the political community of the capital had concluded that the Lancastrian regime was beyond salvage, and had been acclaimed king as Edward IV by the assembled lords and a large gathering of Londoners in early March of 1461. The Battle of Towton, fought on the 29th of March 1461 in a snowstorm in Yorkshire, was the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Contemporary estimates of the casualties, which range widely and reflect the propagandistic as much as the accurate, are impossible to verify, but the engagement was by any measure a military catastrophe for the Lancastrian cause of extraordinary proportions. Henry VI, Margaret of Anjou, and their son fled northward and eventually into exile in Scotland. The Lancastrian army was effectively destroyed as an organised military force. Edward IV's victory at Towton established him as the uncontested military master of England in a way that his father's campaigns had never managed, and his subsequent reign from 1461 to 1470 demonstrates what the Plantagenet line was capable of producing when the right combination of personal capability, political timing, and military fortune came together in the same individual. Edward IV's kingship in the first decade of his reign was in many respects the most personally impressive of any Plantagenet monarch. He was physically striking, reportedly the tallest king in English history, energetic, politically intelligent, and possessed of a personal charm that contemporary sources from both sympathetic and hostile perspectives acknowledge was genuinely powerful. His administrative management of England, particularly in the sphere of royal finances, represented a significant improvement on the chaotic fiscal management that had characterised the Lancastrian period, and his cultivation of London's merchant community, conducted through personal relationships of unusual directness and informality for a medieval king, created a political support base in the capital that proved durable and practically valuable. He was also, in ways that would eventually undermine his political position, a man of considerable sexual appetite and limited capacity for the kind of deferred gratification that prudential kingship required. The marriage of Edward IV to Elizabeth Woodville in May of 1464 was conducted secretly and revealed to the council only when it became impossible to conceal, because Edward had already committed himself, and Elizabeth's birth was not compatible with the diplomatic marriage to a French princess that the Earl of Warwick had been negotiating on his behalf. Elizabeth Woodville was the widow of a minor Lancastrian knight, the daughter of a family of modest rather than distinguished lineage, and the mother of 2 children from her first marriage. The marriage itself was defensible on its own terms. The political consequences were not. The secret conduct of the marriage insulted Warwick, who had been conducting negotiations in France without being informed of the king's true intentions. The elevation of the Woodville family that followed Elizabeth's father became Earl Rivers, her brother Anthony, a significant court figure, and her numerous siblings received titles and offices generated in the Neville family and in other sections of the established baronage, precisely the kind of resentment that the elevation of royal favourites had always generated in English political history. Warwick's rebellion in 1469 and 1470 represents one of the most extraordinary reversals in English political history. Warwick allied himself with Edward's own brother George, Duke of Clarence, who married Warwick's daughter Isabel in July of 1469, despite Edward's explicit prohibition of the match, and organised a military uprising in the north of England that defeated and captured the king himself at the Battle of Edgecote Moor in July of 1469. Edward IV was imprisoned by Warwick at Middleham Castle in Yorkshire, and briefly at other locations, in a situation of bizarre humiliation. The king was a prisoner of his greatest subject, who was simultaneously his cousin and his former ally, while his brother George had married into the family of the man who now held him captive. Warwick's attempt to govern England in Edward's name during the autumn of 1469 collapsed because the English political community, however alarmed by Edward's political conduct, was not prepared to accept government conducted in the name of a king being held prisoner by a subject, and Edward was released. The second phase of the Warwick Rebellion, beginning in the summer of 1470, produced an outcome so remarkable that contemporaries struggled to find adequate language for it. Warwick, recognizing that a second confrontation with Edward would require more powerful backing than he had previously been able to assemble, performed the most spectacular reversal in the political history of the period. He abandoned his Yorkist allegiance entirely and allied himself with Margaret of Anjou and the Lancastrian cause that he had spent the previous decade fighting against. The alliance was sealed by the betrothal of Warwick's younger daughter Anne to Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales, and Warwick invaded England from France in September of 1470 with French support, forcing Edward IV to flee to the Low Countries with a small group of supporters and restoring Henry VI to the throne in what contemporaries called the readaption, the readopting of Henry's kingship. Henry VI, released from the Tower, where he had been held since his capture in 1465, was paraded through London in a condition of personal bewilderment that his supporters found heartbreaking and his opponents found damning. Edward IV's recovery of his throne in the spring of 1471 was as dramatic as his loss of it had been. He landed in England in March of 1471 at Ravenspur in Yorkshire, the same location where his Lancastrian predecessor, Henry Bolingbroke, had landed in 1399. He advanced southward with gathering support, including the crucial defection of his brother George, Duke of Clarence, who abandoned Warwick and returned to his Yorkist allegiance with the political opportunism that had characterised his entire adult career. Warwick was defeated and killed at the Battle of Barnet on Easter Sunday, the 14th of April, 1471, in a battle whose outcome was decided in part by the fog that caused the Lancastrian forces under the Earl of Oxford to attack their own allies in a case of mistaken identity. Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales, was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury on the 4th of May, 1471, in the engagement that destroyed what remained of the Lancastrian military capacity. Margaret of Anjou was captured. Henry VI died in the Tower of London on the night of the 21st or 22nd of May of 1471, officially from grief and melancholy, but almost certainly murdered on Edward IV's orders. Edward IV's second reign, from 1471 to 1483, was both more secure and more purposeful than his first. The destruction of Warwick and the Lancastrian military capacity at Barnet and Tewkesbury, followed by the death of Henry VI and his son, had eliminated all the credible Lancastrian alternatives to Yorkist rule and allowed Edward to govern without the constant pressure of contested legitimacy that had plagued his predecessors. His financial management in this period was the most consistently effective of any medieval English king, generating royal revenues through a combination of parliamentary taxation, commercial income, and the systematic exploitation of the economic opportunities that flowed from his close relationships with London's merchant community, including a personal involvement in trading ventures that would have seemed undignified to his more purely military predecessors. He pursued a measured foreign policy that secured substantial French payments through the Treaty of Picquigny in 1475, without committing England to the kind of sustained and expensive French campaign that had exhausted the Lancastrian regime in the previous generation. The one major political failure of Edward IV's second reign was his management of his brother, George, Duke of Clarence, whose career of political unreliability finally reached its terminal point in 1478. George had been a problem since his youth. He had married against his brother's wishes, had twice allied himself with Warwick against Edward, and had spent the years from 1471 to 1477 alternating between loyal service and acts of private obstruction that reflected his conviction that his royal birth entitled him to more than Edward was prepared to give. When George's wife Isabel died in December of 1476, he pursued a marriage to Mary of Burgundy, the richest heiress in Europe, with a determination that alarmed Edward, who recognized that George, with Burgundian resources, would represent a genuinely dangerous power within England's political landscape. Edward refused the marriage. George's subsequent insubordinate behavior culminated in a public assertion that a woman had been wrongly convicted of poisoning his wife, a claim that implied a challenge to royal justice. In February of 1478, George, Duke of Clarence, was tried by Parliament for treason, convicted, and privately executed within the Tower of London. The method of his execution, drowning in a barrel of Malmsey wine according to the chronicle tradition, may be legendary, but his death was entirely real. Edward IV had ordered the killing of his own brother. Edward IV died on the 9th of April, 1483, at the age of 40 years and 4 months, from an illness whose onset was sudden and whose nature the sources describe with insufficient clinical precision to allow modern diagnosis with confidence. He had apparently been in good health in March when he went out on a fishing expedition, was reported ill shortly afterward, and was dead within a few weeks. He had not made adequate arrangements for the minority governance that his death at this age necessitated. His elder son, the future Edward V, was 12 years old and was residing at Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marches under the guardianship of his Woodville uncle, Anthony, Earl Rivers. The political configuration that Edward IV left behind him was one designed for a situation in which he lived for at least another decade, not for the immediate transfer of power to an untested and relatively young boy, whose royal legitimacy would need to be defended against challenges that Edward's own political choices had made more likely. The events of April to June 1483 represent the most compressed and the most controversial episode in the entire Plantagenet dynastic history, and they have generated a volume of historical, literary, and popular commentary that vastly exceeds what the surviving evidence can definitively support. What is reasonably certain is this: Richard, Duke of Gloucester, acting in his capacity as the elder surviving royal uncle and the man designated in Edward IV's will as protector of the realm during his nephew's minority, intercepted the royal party, bringing the young king to London from Ludlow in late April, arrested the Woodville lords accompanying the young king, including Earl Rivers, had them subsequently executed, and took custody of the young Edward V. Over the following weeks, Richard moved with extraordinary speed to consolidate his political position. He housed the young king in the royal apartments of the Tower of London, secured the young king's younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, from sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, and installed him alongside his brother in the Tower. In June of 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, claimed the throne of England on the basis of an argument presented to the assembled Lords and Commons that he may have had a hand in constructing. The claim that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid because Edward had been pre-contracted to another woman, Eleanor Butler, before the Woodville marriage took place, and that the children of the Woodville marriage were therefore illegitimate and incapable of inheriting the throne. This argument, which was enshrined in the parliamentary petition known as Titulus Regius, provided the formal legal basis for Richard's accession as Richard III, and his coronation took place on the 6th of July, 1483. The two princes, Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, remained in the Tower. They were seen less and less frequently by the outside world through the summer of 1483, and after approximately August or September of that year, they vanished entirely from the historical record. They were never seen in public again. The fate of the princes in the Tower is the most famous unsolved mystery of English history, and the centuries of debate it has generated reflect both the genuine absence of conclusive contemporary evidence and the degree to which the question has been entangled with partisan assessments of Richard III's character. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the princes were alive when they entered the Tower, that they disappeared during the summer of 1483, that Richard was king and therefore had both the means and a clear political motive for their elimination, and that the contemporary chronicle evidence, while limited in its reliability, is consistent with the hypothesis that they were killed on Richard's orders. The alternative hypotheses that have been proposed that they survived into Richard's reign or beyond, or that they were killed by someone other than Richard, carry evidentiary burdens that their proponents have not successfully discharged. The most reasonable reading of the evidence, which is acknowledged to be incomplete, supports the conclusion that they were murdered in the Tower in the summer of 1483. If this conclusion is correct, Richard III had caused the murder of his own nephews, the sons of the brother to whom he had been consistently loyal throughout his adult life, within months of that brother's death. The reign of Richard III, from 1483 to 1485, presents a figure of extraordinary complexity that historians have never satisfactorily resolved into a single coherent assessment. He governed England with genuine administrative competence. His legal reforms, though implemented across the brief span of a single parliament, were thoughtful and in some respects progressive. His personal relationships in the north of England, where he had governed for his brother, were warm and reciprocal in ways that his subsequent conduct elsewhere made difficult to reconcile. He was also, by the most plausible reading of events, a man who had usurped his nephew's throne through a legal fiction of doubtful credibility, had killed his nephews to secure that throne, and had then watched the political support that had made his coup possible drain away with a speed that reflected the English nobility's acute sensitivity to the difference between a legitimate succession and a successful power. Seizure. The rebellion against Richard III that broke out in the autumn of 1483, led by Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, who had been one of the principal architects of Richard's seizure of power just months earlier, demonstrated the fragility of the political foundation on which Richard's kingship rested. Buckingham's reasons for rebellion at this particular moment remain somewhat unclear, and the sources that have survived reflect partisan perspectives that make their reliability uncertain. The rebellion was suppressed without great difficulty. Buckingham was captured and executed at Salisbury in November of 1483. But the fact that Buckingham had rebelled at all, and that the rebellion had been coordinated with a broader movement that looked toward the Earl of Richmond, Henry Tudor, as a potential alternative king, revealed that the legitimacy deficit of Richard's kingship was already generating opposition of a kind that could not be permanently suppressed by military means. Henry Tudor was, by any strict assessment of the genealogical evidence, a claimant to the English throne of limited persuasiveness. He was descended from John of Gaunt through the Beaufort line, the descendants of John of Gaunt's relationship with Catherine Swynford, conducted before their eventual marriage and retrospectively legitimised by parliamentary statute in 1397, though the statute had included a provision excluding the Beaufort line from the royal succession, a provision whose legal weight was debated. His claim, through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, was senior to his paternal descent, but even through his mother, he was descended from an explicitly legitimised but succession-excluded line. His father, Edmund Tudor, had been the son of Owen Tudor, a Welshman who had married the Dowager Queen Catherine of Valois, Henry V's widow, giving the Tudor line a connection to the royal blood of France rather than England. Henry Tudor's claim to the English throne was, in legal terms, weaker than almost any other claimant who had ever successfully pressed a royal pretension in English history. What made it politically viable was not its genealogical strength, but the absence of alternatives and the depth of the disillusionment with Richard III that the events of 1483 had generated. Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven in Wales on the 7th of August 1485, with a force of perhaps 2,000 French mercenaries and a smaller number of English exiles. He marched north and east through Wales, gathering Welsh support as he moved, and met Richard III's army at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire on the 22nd of August 1485. The battle that decided the fate of the Plantagenet dynasty was not, by the standards of the campaigns that had preceded it, a large engagement. Richard III had a substantially larger army than Henry Tudor, and if that army had fought as a coherent unit, the outcome might well have been different. What decided Bosworth was the treachery of two of the largest contingents in Richard's army. Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, who commanded Richard's rearguard, refused to engage and stood with his forces watching the battle without participating. Thomas Stanley and William Stanley, whose family relationship with Henry Tudor, Thomas Stanley, had married Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, gave them an obvious personal interest in the Tudor cause, held their forces back during the critical phase of the battle before the Stanleys committed their forces against Richard. Richard III died at Bosworth on the 22nd of August 1485, charging across the battlefield toward Henry Tudor in a desperate personal assault that, if successful, would have ended the battle in a single decisive moment. He came close enough to Henry to kill Henry's standard-bearer before he was surrounded and killed. He was 32 years old. The crown, according to tradition, was found on the battlefield and placed on Henry Tudor's head by Lord Stanley. Richard's body was stripped, mutilated, and carried to Leicester tied across a horse, where it was briefly displayed before burial at the Greyfriars Church, where it would remain undiscovered until the excavation of a Leicester car park in 2012 revealed his remains in a condition that confirmed his scoliosis, previously dismissed by some as Tudor propaganda, and the manner of his death through multiple trauma wounds consistent with combat. Henry VII, who became king through victory at Bosworth, was the first English king since the Norman conquest who owed his throne entirely to military victory over his predecessor rather than to any principle of hereditary succession that the political community recognized as legitimate. He was also, in the strictly dynastic terms that concern this narrative, the last king whose lineage connected him to the Plantagenet line. His grandmother was Catherine of Valois. His great-grandmother through his mother's line was Catherine Swynford, and his mother was Margaret Beaufort, the last significant figure in the Beaufort line. The dynasty whose internal conflicts had consumed England for 3 decades was finished. The dynasty that replaced it was, in terms of its connection to the Plantagenet blood, a collateral consequence of those connections rather than their natural inheritor. What Henry VII inherited from the Plantagenet dynasty was therefore not merely a kingdom, but the accumulated consequences of 3 centuries, choices about how to manage power, family, and loyalty. He also inherited the specific form of instability those choices had created, a surplus of Plantagenet blood in the persons of surviving members of the House of York, who represented potential alternative claimants to his throne as long as they lived. The precarious character of Henry VII's early kingship was not produced by the weakness of his military position after Bosworth, but by the continuing existence of Yorkist claimants whose genealogical credentials were in some cases stronger than his own. The surviving members of the Yorkist line found themselves in a position of simultaneous privilege and danger that was the direct product of the dynastic history that had placed them where they were. To possess Plantagenet blood in the England of 1485 was to carry a distinction that had become indistinguishable from a liability. The fate of these Yorkist pretenders illustrated with particular clarity mechanism by which Plantagenet blood had become a form of death sentence for those who possessed it or claimed it. Lambert Simnel, defeated at the Battle of Stoke in June of 1487, in what is sometimes identified as the last battle of the Wars of the Roses, was treated with the contemptuous mercy that Henry reserved for those he considered too unimportant to be genuinely dangerous. He was put to work in the royal kitchens and eventually promoted to the position of royal falconer, a punishment so elaborately humiliating that it served as its own commentary on the absurdity of his pretensions. Perkin Warbeck, whose claim was more elaborately constructed and more persistently maintained, attracted support from Scotland, from Burgundy, and from disaffected English nobles throughout the 1490s, and conducted invasions or attempted invasions of England that Henry consistently defeated through a combination of military preparedness, diplomatic pressure on those providing Warbeck with external support, and the systematic identification and execution of those within England who had conspired with him. Warbeck was captured in 1497 and initially treated with relative restraint. He was kept at the English court rather than imprisoned, in a display of royal confidence that also served as a demonstration of contempt. His subsequent escape attempt led to his imprisonment in the Tower, and his imprisonment in the Tower brought him into contact with Edward of Warwick, and their alleged conspiracy together provided Henry VII with the justification for the most consequential executions of his reign. Both Warbeck and Warwick were tried and executed in November of 1499. Edward of Warwick's execution was particularly significant. He was the last unambiguous male Plantagenet, the last person who could claim by straightforward patrilineal descent from Edward III to a title superior to Henry VII's own, and he was completely innocent of any genuine treasonous intent. He had spent his entire life, from early childhood, in captivity, had never been educated in the ways of the court or exposed to the political world, and was reportedly so ignorant of basic events of his time that he could not distinguish a goose from a capon. He was executed because he existed, because Plantagenet blood had become, in the political environment that the dynasty's history had created, an inherently dangerous attribute that no amount of personal innocence could neutralize. The death of Edward of Warwick in November of 1499, combined with the earlier deaths and disappearances of the other significant Yorkist figures, left the English political landscape cleared of the Plantagenet alternatives to Tudor rule, with a thoroughness that no previous attempt to manage the dynasty's proliferating bloodlines had achieved. Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, whose daughter Catherine of Aragon was being negotiated as a bride for Henry VII's eldest son Arthur, were reportedly reassured by the elimination of Warwick because they had been concerned about the stability of the Tudor succession. The calculation that led to Warwick's death was therefore embedded in a diplomatic context as well as a domestic security one. Henry VII killed an innocent man, partly to close a foreign policy deal. The Plantagenet blood that had cost its bearers so much for 3 centuries was now so dangerous that a young man who had never done anything, never sought anything, never threatened anyone, was killed for possessing it and for the anxiety that his existence created in those who understood the genealogical calculus of royal succession. The deeper structural explanation for what had happened to the Plantagenet dynasty requires returning to the foundational moment of Henry II's reign and the specific set of choices that set the pattern for everything that followed. Henry II's inability or unwillingness to provide adequately for his sons, while retaining the authority he regarded as inseparable from his own identity, was not simply a personal failure of parenting or political judgment. It was the expression of a fundamental tension within the structure of medieval kingship as it had developed in the Plantagenet territories. The tension between the territorial logic of inheritance, which distributed land and therefore power among family members, and the administrative logic of centralized royal government, which concentrated power in the hands of a single ruler. Henry II had spent his reign building an administrative monarchy of unprecedented capability, and the more capable that monarchy became, the more its concentration of power contradicted the expectation of its beneficiaries that royal blood would be rewarded with territorial authority proportionate to its dignity. Every subsequent generation of Plantagenet rulers repeated some version of this contradiction without resolving it, because the contradiction was structural rather than personal and could not be resolved by individual choice without dismantling either the territorial logic of dynastic inheritance or the administrative logic of centralized government. that made the dynasty valuable in the first place. Richard I's forgiveness of John, twice repeated, was not mere sentimentality. It was the expression of a genuine dilemma. Punishing John severely would have required either imprisoning or disinheriting the only surviving brother of a king who had no legitimate children, and either of those outcomes would have created problems more immediately dangerous than the problems that John's conduct had already generated. John's murder of Arthur of Brittany, if that is indeed what it was similarly an expression of structural logic rather than mere personal viciousness. Arthur alive was an alternative centre of Plantagenet loyalty that John's precarious hold on the continental territories could not sustain, and the calculation that Arthur dead was safer than Arthur alive was one that the structure of the inheritance problem imposed, rather than one that John invented from personal malice. The problem was not that these men were uniquely wicked. The problem was that the structure of the dynasty they inhabited made ordinary human ambitions and ordinary human fears generate extraordinary destruction. The role of women in the Plantagenet dynastic narrative deserves considerably more attention than the tradition of political history, which has tended to focus on kings and their male allies and opponents, has typically given it, because the women of the Plantagenet line were consistently among the most consequential actors in the drama of its internal destruction. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who supported the rebellion of her sons against their father in 1173, brought to the revolt not merely her political connections, but her territorial authority over Aquitaine, which made the rebellion a three-dimensional military problem rather than a simple two-dimensional family conflict. Isabella of France, who overthrew her husband Edward II through a combination of personal grievance and political calculation, accomplished something that no previous baronial opposition to a Plantagenet king had managed: the formal deposition of a king and his replacement by his own son, under her own effective governance for the subsequent 3 years. Margaret of Anjou, who fought for the Lancastrian cause with a tenacity and a military commitment that surpassed anything her husband was capable of, sustained the Lancastrian resistance for years beyond the point at which it would otherwise have collapsed, and in doing so prolonged the civil war and increased its casualties in ways that the eventual Yorkist settlement could not undo. Eleanor of Aquitaine's career spanned 8 decades and 3 reigns, and her trajectory from Queen of France through the dramatic annulment of her first marriage in 1152 to Queen of England through her marriage to Henry II to political prisoner for 16 years, to the dominant political figure of Richard I's reign and the institutional anchor of English royal government during his absences, represents the most extraordinary individual Plantagenet career of any generation. Her support for the rebellion of 1173 was not simply the act of an aggrieved wife, though it was certainly that. It was also the act of a ruler of Aquitaine, who had been effectively stripped of meaningful authority over her own duchy by a husband who governed it through her as his administrative agent rather than as her own territory. The rebellion she supported was in part a bid to recover the political agency that her marriage to Henry II had apparently secured and then progressively diminished. Her subsequent imprisonment, maintained for 16 years through the reigns of Henry II and into the early years of Richard's reign, demonstrated both Henry's understanding of her political capabilities and his unwillingness to take the steps, either separation or greater autonomy, that might have addressed her grievances without generating a crisis. The pattern of Plantagenet queens, whose political capabilities exceeded their husbands' willingness to employ them constructively, and who then became political actors against, rather than alongside their spouses, extends beyond Eleanor and Isabella, to include figures whose influence was less dramatic but equally consequential. Philippa of Hainault, Edward III's queen, whose effective management of the kingdom during his long absences, and whose political judgment was respected even by those who found Edward himself more personally appealing, represents the constructive end of this spectrum. A queen whose capabilities were deployed rather than suppressed, and who therefore operated within the existing structure rather than against it. Margaret of Anjou represents the other end, a queen whose capabilities were all that stood between the Lancastrian regime and immediate collapse, whose employment of those capabilities was forced upon her by her husband's absolute incapacity rather than chosen by either of them, and who was then judged by the political culture of her time for exercising the authority that the situation demanded rather than the deference that convention expected. The children of these extraordinary women were themselves shaped by the specific configurations of authority and deprivation that characterized their parents' relationships. Richard I, who had watched his mother imprisoned for 16 years for the act of supporting his rebellion, was a man who had learned from earliest childhood that royal authority was negotiated through conflict rather than natural affiliation, and that the family was a political entity whose internal relationships were governed by the same calculations of advantage and disadvantage that governed its external ones. John, who had been his father's favourite and had still ended by betraying him, understood from the same childhood experience that favour was contingent rather than absolute, and that the structure of the dynasty made even the most favoured son a potential threat whose interests would eventually conflict with the father's. These understandings, absorbed in childhood from lived experience rather than learned from texts, shaped the political reflexes of these men in ways that made the betrayal pattern self-replicating across generations. The Church's role in the Plantagenet dynastic narrative is equally significant and similarly underappreciated. The crisis of Henry II's reign that destroyed his friendship with Thomas Becket and produced Becket's murder in Canterbury Cathedral in December of 1170 was not merely a conflict between royal and ecclesiastical authority over specific legal jurisdictions, though it was certainly that. It was also an expression of the same fundamental tension between centralized authority and competing institutional claims that structured the entire dynastic history. Henry's constitutions of Clarendon in 1164, which attempted to define the boundaries of royal and ecclesiastical jurisdiction in ways that the papacy found unacceptable, were motivated by the same administrative logic that drove his reforms in every other area of governance: the desire to create a unified, centrally administered royal government in which all significant institutional actors operated within a framework of royal definition and royal oversight. Becket's resistance, whatever its mixture of principled conviction and personal pride, challenged that project at its most ambitious point, and Henry's response, the furious outburst that produced the 4 nights' journey to Canterbury and Becket's murder, demonstrated how completely the logic of Plantagenet administrative ambition could overwhelm the political judgment that should have governed the exercise of power. The murder of Thomas Becket demonstrated with particular vividness a pattern that would repeat itself throughout Plantagenet dynastic history: the destruction of exactly the kind of loyal intermediary whose existence was most essential to effective governance. Becket had been Henry's chancellor before becoming archbishop, had been his personal friend as well as his administrative instrument, and had been expected by Henry to remain his ally in curtailing ecclesiastical judicial autonomy. That Becket had instead become the most formidable opponent of that project was a consequence of the elevation itself. The office of archbishop carried obligations to the institutional church that competed with personal loyalty to the king, and Becket understood those obligations with a seriousness that surprised Henry precisely because Henry had not expected the institutional role to transform the man. The subsequent history of the Plantagenet dynasty's relationship with the church repeated the Becket episode's fundamental dynamic in different registers across successive generations. John's conflict with Pope Innocent III, which produced the interdict on England from 1208 to 1213, and John's own excommunication, was rooted in the same fundamental question of royal control over ecclesiastical appointments that had generated the Becket crisis, though John's conduct of the dispute was considerably less coherent than Henry's, and his eventual submission to papal authority in 1213, which made England a papal fief in formal terms in exchange for the lifting of the interdict, was a diplomatic capitulation of humiliating proportions. Henry III's elevation of his Savoyard and Lusignan relatives to ecclesiastical offices, as well as secular ones, compounded the baronial grievance with a specifically ecclesiastical dimension, since the foreign bishops and abbots, who benefited from royal patronage, were drawing English church revenues toward foreign beneficiaries. Edward I's conflicts with the papacy, over taxation of the clergy, which culminated in the clerical tax dispute of 1296 and 1297, and the promulgation of Clericis Laicos by Pope Boniface VIII, represented yet another iteration of the same conflict between royal fiscal ambition and ecclesiastical institutional independence that had structured the relationship since Henry II's time. What the Plantagenet dynasty's relationship with the Church reveals, when viewed across the full span of 3 centuries, is the degree to which every significant institutional relationship that the dynasty attempted to manage was governed by the same underlying dynamic that governed its internal family relationships. The fundamental Plantagenet impulse, expressed through the administrative genius of Henry II and replicated in modified forms by his more capable successors, was toward the centralization of authority in royal hands and the subordination of competing institutional claims to royal oversight and definition. This impulse was both the dynasty's greatest strength, producing the administrative monarchy that gave England its common law, its parliamentary institutions, and its governmental machinery, and its greatest weakness, generating resistance from every institutional actor whose claims it threatened: the Church, the baronage, the papacy, the Welsh, the Scots, the French. All of them at various points found themselves in opposition to Plantagenet, centralizing ambition, and the opposition of each of them added its own dimension to the structural instability that made the dynasty's internal conflicts so consistently destructive. The legal dimension of the Plantagenet story is similarly illuminating when examined with attention to its internal contradictions. The development of English common law under Henry II and his successors was one of the most consequential intellectual and institutional achievements of medieval Europe, creating a legal system that would shape the development of law in every country that the British Empire subsequently touched. The mechanisms Henry developed, the writ system, the heir, the assize, the jury, represented a genuine transformation of the relationship between royal authority and individual legal rights that created, over time, a culture of legalism in England that distinguished it from most continental political traditions. Yet the same dynasty that created these legal institutions used them, with painful consistency, as instruments of political manipulation whenever the political stakes were high enough. John seized the Lancastrian inheritance in a legal proceeding that violated the principles of inheritance law that his own administration was developing and applying in other contexts. Richard II extracted sweeping parliamentary powers through proceedings that nominally complied with constitutional forms while evacuating those forms of any substantive meaning. Richard III justified his seizure of his nephew's throne through a legal argument whose technical construction was careful and whose substantive validity was deeply questionable. The gap between the legal institutions the Plantagenets built and the use they made of those institutions when dynastic interest demanded, it is one of the most revealing features of the dynasty's history, because it demonstrates that the institutional achievements were not simply expressions of the dynasty's values, but were also, in part, instruments of dynastic power that could be deployed or abandoned, depending on whether their deployment or abandonment served the dynasty's immediate interests. The common law was built, in significant part, because it was useful to the crown in establishing royal jurisdiction over matters that had previously been handled by baronial or ecclesiastical courts. It was abandoned in the specific contexts where abandoning it served a more immediate royal purpose, with a casualness that revealed the instrumental character of the commitment. This does not diminish the institutional achievement, which was real and durable and outlasted the dynasty that created it by centuries. But it does complicate the narrative of Plantagenet constitutional contribution by revealing the extent to which that contribution was a byproduct of dynastic ambition rather than a principled commitment to the rule of law for its own. Sake. The financial history of the Plantagenet dynasty provides yet another perspective on the mechanisms of its self-destruction. The enormous territorial expansion of Henry II's reign created an administrative structure whose maintenance required revenues on a scale that none of his predecessors had needed to generate. The taxation mechanisms that the dynasty developed to meet this need, scutage, tallage, parliamentary subsidies, and eventually the graduated income taxes of Edward I's reign, were consistently more sophisticated and more productive than those of any comparable European monarchy, and they generated the resources that funded the military campaigns, the building programs, and the administrative expansion that gave the dynasty its distinctive character. They also generated, with equal consistency, the political resentment that was one of the most reliable sources of baronial opposition across the entire period. The relationship between fiscal innovation and political crisis runs through Plantagenet history, with a regularity that suggests a structural connection rather than a series of coincidences. John's taxation generated Magna Carta. Henry III's financial mismanagement generated the provisions of Oxford. Edward I's aggressive fiscal demands generated the constitutional crises of the 1290s. Edward II's inability to finance military success generated the collapse of baronial loyalty. And the Lancastrian fiscal exhaustion of the 1440s and 1450s was a direct contributing factor to the political crisis that produced the Wars of the Roses. The geography of Plantagenet power deserves explicit consideration as a structural factor in the dynasty's internal conflicts. The empire that Henry II governed at its greatest extent was not a unified territorial bloc, but an assemblage of distinct political units, each with its own legal traditions, its own aristocracy, its own ecclesiastical organization, and its own linguistic character, held together not by any principle of organic unity, but by the personal authority of a single ruler who was simultaneously Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, Duke of Aquitaine, and King of England. Governing this assemblage required the ruler to be physically present in multiple locations simultaneously, which was impossible, and to delegate authority to agents who would act as substitutes, which was politically dangerous, because delegation created conditions for independent power centers that could challenge the authority being delegated. Henry II spent his reign in almost constant motion between England and the continent, trying to maintain effective personal oversight of a territorial complex that would have challenged any system of governance to manage, and that challenged the specific system Henry was building, one dependent on royal personal authority, exercised through trained administrative agents beyond its sustainable limits. The young king's rebellion of 1173 was in part a response to the impossibility of the position created by Henry's administrative arrangements. The empire required a strong central authority, and the strong central authority was incompatible with the territorial devolution that the size of the empire logically demanded. Richard I's solution to the same problem, which was, essentially, to abandon the continental territories to their own governance while he pursued military glory elsewhere, and to govern England through a delegation of administrative authority that was, in the event, insufficient to prevent his brother's machinations, demonstrated that there was no satisfactory resolution to the geographical paradox. John's loss of Normandy in 1204 was, in this sense, not merely a military defeat, but the structural consequence of a territorial complex that had always been too large to be governed by any mechanism available in the 12th or 13th centuries. The loss of Normandy in 1204 had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate reduction in Plantagenet territorial extent. It forced the English baronage, many of whom had held lands on both sides of the Channel, to choose definitively between their English and their French allegiances, a choice that over the following generations produced a baronage that was unambiguously English in its primary political identity, in a way that the Norman and Angevin aristocracy of the preceding century and a half had not been. This Anglicization of the baronage was in many respects a positive development for the stability of English royal government, since it created a political community with genuinely shared interests in the English kingdom, rather than a class whose loyalties were divided between English and continental holdings. But it also removed a significant source of institutional flexibility. The barons who had straddled the Channel had provided, through their multiple allegiances and their contacts with continental political culture, a moderating influence on the most extreme expressions of royal ambition on one side and baronial assertion on the other. The more thoroughly English the baronage became, the more exclusively the conflicts of English politics were fought out between specifically English institutional actors without the mediating influence of broader European connections. The French dimension of the Plantagenet story, which has appeared throughout this narrative as context and consequence rather than as its central subject, deserves a moment of direct attention because the relationship between England and France structured the dynasty's external ambitions in ways that consistently reinforced its internal contradictions. The Plantagenet claim to French territories, first through Norman inheritance, then through Angevin territorial accumulation, and finally, through the English crown's assertion of its right to the French throne, itself required sustained military campaigns, whose fiscal demands were the primary driver of the taxation crises that repeatedly destabilized English royal government. The French wars were popular with the English baronage when they produced victories and plunder, and deeply unpopular when they produced defeats and taxation without compensation. The correlation between the success of French military campaigns and the stability of English domestic politics is one of the most consistent relationships in the entire Plantagenet period. Henry V's domestic political consolidation was inseparable from the military success of Agincourt, and the collapse of Lancastrian domestic authority was inseparable from the military failures in France in the 1440s and 1450s. The constitutional legacy that the Plantagenet dynasty bequeathed to subsequent English history is genuine and significant, but it requires careful qualification to be properly understood. Parliament, the common law, the systems of local governance through justices of the peace and sheriffs, the development of equity jurisdiction alongside the common law courts, all of these institutions, whose foundations were laid during the Plantagenet period, represent genuine contributions to the development of English, subsequently British and American constitutional traditions. What they do not represent, however, is the product of a coherent constitutional vision on the part of the dynasty that created them. They are, in significant part, the residue of political crises, the specific institutional responses that political actors, on both the royal and baronial sides, fashioned in order to manage or resolve conflicts that the structure of Plantagenet governance consistently generated. Magna Carta emerged from John's political bankruptcy. Parliament developed its taxation powers from the fiscal crises of successive reigns. The common law expanded its jurisdiction from the competition between royal and baronial and ecclesiastical courts that the Plantagenet administrative ambition generated. The institutional achievements are real and durable. Their origins are in conflict, rather than in design, in the specific responses to specific crises, rather than in any general program of constitutional development. This qualification does not diminish the significance of what was built during the 3 1/3 centuries of Plantagenet rule. It does suggest that the building was accomplished despite, and in significant part because of, the dynasty's consistent failures to manage its own internal contradictions. The Plantagenet contribution to English constitutional development was the unintended consequence of a dynasty so consistently capable of generating crises that the resolution of each crisis required institutional innovation, and so consistent in the specific character of the crises it generated. Royal overreach, baronial opposition, financial mismanagement, dynastic conflict that the institutions developed to manage those crises accumulated over time into a coherent constitutional framework whose coherence was achieved by accretion rather than design. The English constitution, to the extent that such a thing can be said to exist, was built by people trying to survive the Plantagenets, not by the Plantagenets themselves trying to build a constitution. The military history of the Plantagenet dynasty illuminates the internal contradictions with particular clarity, because military capacity was the most fundamental expression of royal authority in the medieval period. Henry II's military campaigns established the martial credentials that underpinned his administrative authority. Richard I's reputation, built on the Third Crusade and campaigns in France, provided the charismatic foundation for a kingship whose personal character required exactly that kind of public validation. Edward III's extraordinary military record produced the apogee of Plantagenet martial prestige and the most thoroughgoing identification of the dynasty with the chivalric values that the political culture of the 14th century regarded as the essential expression of royal excellence. But the relationship between military success and political stability was not a simple one of cause and effect, because military success required resources, resources required taxation, taxation required political consent, and political consent required the kind of broadly distributed distribution of military patronage and military rewards that a successful campaign could provide, but that the fiscal demands of the campaign itself tended to consume. The military machine that the Plantagenets built required constant feeding, and the political consequences of any failure to provide that feeding were immediate and severe. The baronage, who rode to war in the service of the Plantagenet kings, expected, and received during successful campaigns, the material rewards of military victory, ransoms, plunder, grants of land in conquered territories, and the social prestige that association with a militarily successful king conferred. When military campaigns failed, as they did under John in Normandy, under Henry III in Gascony and Poitou, under Edward II in Scotland, and under Henry VI in France, the same baronage who had benefited from the taxes raised for those campaigns bore the cost of their failure without receiving the compensating rewards that success would have provided, and their resentment was both financially grounded and culturally intense. The specific form of military failure that proved most consistently destructive was not battlefield defeat, but the failure of siege operations, because the siege represented the point at which the logistical and organizational dimensions of warfare were most clearly exposed, and the consequences of inadequate preparation were most immediately and irreversibly evident. John's failure to relieve the siege of Chateau Gaillard in 1203 and 1204, which led to the fall of Normandy, was not simply a military defeat. It was an administrative and organizational failure that revealed the collapse of the Norman baronage's confidence in John's ability to govern the duchy effectively, a confidence whose erosion had been produced by years of exactly the kind of arbitrary and suspicious behavior that John's history made inevitable. Edward II's failure at Bannockburn in June of 1314, which was a battlefield defeat of a more direct kind, was nonetheless similarly conditioned by the administrative failure to provide adequate logistical support for a campaign whose ambitions exceeded its preparation, and by the political failure that had alienated many of the Scottish border lords whose local knowledge and auxiliary support would have been essential for sustained operations north of the border. The relationship between military capability and the specific mechanism of Plantagenet dynastic self-destruction becomes most visible in the Wars of the Roses, where the military campaigns were overwhelmingly between different branches of the Plantagenet family rather than against external opponents, and where the resources being consumed were those of the English kingdom rather than those of a conquered territory. The battles of the Wars of the Roses, St. Albans, Northampton, Wakefield, Mortimer's Cross, Towton, Hedgeley Moor, Hexham, Barnet, Tewkesbury, and Bosworth represent the accumulated military cost of the genealogical complexity that 3 centuries of prolific Plantagenet procreation had created. Each battle was fought, at least in part, by Plantagenet blood against Plantagenet blood. The dukes and earls and lords who commanded the armies on both sides were, in most cases, the descendants, whether legitimate or collateral, of Edward III and his sons, the products of exactly the dynastic fecundity that Edward had regarded as his dynasty's strength and that had become its most dangerous vulnerability. The arithmetic of Plantagenet genealogical complexity deserves a moment of specific attention because it explains, with particular precision, why the conflicts of the second half of the 15th century were both inevitable and irresolvable by any mechanism short of the dynastic extinction that eventually produced their resolution. Edward III had 5 sons who survived to maturity. Those 5 sons produced numerous children who themselves produced numerous children. By the 1450s, the number of individuals who could trace a descent from Edward III through one line or another was substantial, and the number who could construct a plausible argument for a superior claim to the throne, depending on which principles of succession one emphasized, was sufficient to ensure that no resolution of the succession question would satisfy all the significant claimants simultaneously. The House of Lancaster derived its claim through John of Gaunt, Edward's third son. The House of York derived its strongest claim through the Mortimer line from Lionel of Antwerp, Edward's second son. The Beaufort family derived its claim from John of Gaunt's legitimised line. The descendants of Edmund of Langley, Edward's fourth son, and Thomas of Woodstock, his fifth son, added further complexity to an already intricate genealogical map. Any resolution that recognised one set of descent principles as determining would necessarily disadvantage those whose claims rested on alternative principles, and those disadvantaged claimants, if they possessed the military resources and the political connections to contest the resolution, had every rational incentive to do so. The Wars of the Roses were therefore not simply the result of the specific wickedness or ambition of particular individuals, though wickedness and ambition played their parts. They were the predictable outcome of a dynastic configuration that the Plantagenets had spent 3 centuries constructing, one in which too many people had too strong a claim and too much capacity to press it for any stable resolution to be achievable within the existing constitutional framework. The framework that actually resolved the problem, the Tudor settlement that followed Bosworth, worked not through genealogical clarity, but through the extinction of the most dangerous alternative claimants, combined with the new dynasty's careful management of what remained of the Plantagenet bloodline in the persons of those who could theoretically challenge Tudor authority. The question of whether the Plantagenet dynastic narrative should be understood primarily as tragedy or as a cautionary tale about the structural limitations of medieval governance has occupied historians since the earliest attempts to make sense of the period's extraordinary sequence of conflicts and crises. The tragic reading, which has been most influentially expressed in the literary tradition that reaches from Shakespeare's history, plays through the romanticized historical fiction of the 19th century, emphasizes the personal dimensions of the dynastic story. The father who loved one son and was betrayed by him, the king who loved his friend too well and destroyed his dynasty for that love, the queen who fought with extraordinary courage for a cause that her husband was incapable of sustaining. These personal narratives are real and genuinely moving, and they capture something essential about the way in which medieval politics was conducted through the medium of personal relationships rather than impersonal institutional mechanisms. But the tragic reading, however emotionally compelling, risks obscuring the structural dimensions that were ultimately more determinative than any individual's personal qualities or choices. The Plantagenet dynasty did not destroy itself because its members were unusually wicked or unusually weak or unusually blind to the consequences of their actions. Some of them were wicked, some were weak, some were remarkably blind, but these qualities were not evenly distributed across the dynasty, and the pattern of self-destruction appeared, regardless of which qualities any particular generation happened to manifest. Henry II was a ruler of exceptional capability and administrative genius, and he created the conditions for the first great familial catastrophe through the very success of his administrative achievement. Edward III was the most personally impressive of all the Plantagenet kings, a man of genuine martial excellence and personal magnetism, and he created the conditions for the Wars of the Roses through the excessive abundance of his dynastic fecundity. The structural reading does not deny the reality of individual choices and individual character. It insists that those choices were made within a framework whose constraints were powerful enough to produce similar outcomes from very different inputs. The comparison with other medieval dynasties illuminates the specifically Plantagenet character of the dynastic self-destruction by demonstrating that the structural tensions were not unique to the Plantagenet configuration, but that the specific way in which those tensions expressed themselves was. The Capetian dynasty of France, which provided the context and often the instrument for Plantagenet continental difficulties, managed its succession with a consistency and a stability that the Plantagenets never achieved, producing an unbroken male line from Hugh Capet in 987 to the death of Charles IV in 1328, without a single serious succession crisis, a genealogical achievement of extraordinary improbability that reflected both the Capetians' good fortune in producing sons and their political capacity to manage the expectations of those sons sufficiently to prevent the explosive conflicts that were endemic in the Plantagenet line. The Holy Roman Emperors, who faced succession challenges of comparable complexity to those of the Plantagenets, developed institutional mechanisms, the electoral college, the concept of the empire as an office rather than a hereditary possession that partially disaggregated the succession question from the personal qualities of the incumbent in ways that the English constitutional tradition resisted, because of its strong hereditary principle. What distinguished the Plantagenet situation from these comparators was the specific combination of a very strong hereditary succession principle, which meant that alternative claimants could always construct credible cases based on descent, with a very weak mechanism for resolving competing claims, which meant that military force was the ultimate arbiter when multiple credible claims existed simultaneously. The French Capetians benefited from the extraordinary demographic good fortune of continuous male descent that made the hereditary principle unambiguous. The Holy Roman Emperors benefited from the electoral principle that provided a formal mechanism for choosing between alternative claimants. The English had neither. They had a hereditary principle strong enough to generate multiple legitimate claimants, but not so unambiguous as to automatically determine which of them should prevail, and they lacked the institutional mechanism that might have resolved the ambiguity without recourse to force. Every significant succession dispute in Plantagenet history, the anarchy, the dispute over Arthur of Brittany, the deposition of Edward II, the deposition of Richard II, the Wars of the Roses was ultimately resolved by military force because there was no institutional mechanism capable of producing a politically binding resolution that the competing parties would accept. The development of Parliament as an institution during the Plantagenet period created the possibility of such a mechanism. The parliamentary recognition of a particular succession had been used in the depositions of Edward II and Richard II, and in the Act of Accord of 1460, but Parliament's authority was itself contingent on the political support of those who sat in it, and political support could not be separated from the military and financial resources of the magnates who provided it. Parliament could ratify a succession that the political community accepted for other reasons, but it could not create acceptance where none existed, because it had no enforcement mechanism independent of the power of the king or the great lords who dominated its proceedings. The institutional limitation was therefore the same structural problem in a different register. The absence of any mechanism for binding resolution that did not ultimately depend on the specific distribution of physical force among the competing parties at any given moment. The intellectual history of the Plantagenet period, which produced extraordinary achievements in law, theology, natural philosophy, and vernacular literature alongside the political and military catastrophes that dominate the conventional historical narrative, offers one further perspective on the dynasty's contradictory character. The 12th and 13th centuries, which correspond roughly to the founding and development of the dynasty under Henry II and his immediate successors, were among the most intellectually productive in European history, producing the scholastic synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, the development of Gothic architecture, the emergence of the European university system, and the beginnings of vernacular literature in French and English that would eventually produce Chaucer and the great tradition of English letters. The Plantagenet court was a participant in this broader European intellectual culture in ways that the purely political narrative tends to obscure. Henry II's court included some of the most distinguished scholars and administrators of his era, and the administrative revolution he carried out was in part a product of the application of newly available intellectual tools, Roman law concepts, scholastic methods of textual analysis, and logical argument to the practical problems of governance. The contradiction that this intellectual vitality represents in relation to the political narrative of dynastic self-destruction is not a superficial one. The dynasty that produced the most sophisticated administrative monarchy in Europe, the most developed common law tradition in the world, some of the greatest Gothic architectural achievements of the medieval period, and eventually the literary culture from which English literature as a recognizable tradition emerged. This dynasty also produced the murder of children in the Tower, the execution of innocent men for the political inconvenience of their survival, the sustained civil wars that depopulated entire regions of England in the 1450s and 1460s, and the 3 centuries-long pattern of father against son, brother against brother, uncle against nephew that defines the dynastic narrative. The intellectual achievements do not offset the political catastrophes, and the political catastrophes do not cancel the intellectual achievements. Both are genuinely the products of the same dynasty, and understanding the Plantagenets requires holding both in view simultaneously, rather than allowing the one to overshadow the other. The specific mechanism of betrayal that gives this narrative its organizing theme requires one final examination. The word betrayal implies the violation of an expected loyalty, a commitment breached, a trust broken. But medieval political culture, particularly at the level of the royal family and the high nobility, understood family loyalty as a real obligation operating within a framework of competing obligations to God, to feudal superiors, to the political community of the realm that could override it in sufficiently extreme circumstances. The rebels of 1173 were not simply sons betraying a father. They were, from their own perspective, acting on an obligation to secure the territorial inheritance of their royal birth entitled them to expect, an obligation they regarded as no less real than the filial obligation they were violating in pursuing it. This does not excuse the betrayals, but it contextualizes them in a way that makes them comprehensible rather than simply monstrous. The same contextualizing framework applies to John's betrayal of Richard III's seizure of his nephew's inheritance, and Henry Bolingbroke's deposition of Richard II. In each case, the actor in question could construct a narrative in which his actions were justified by obligations that superseded the specific loyalty he was violating. John's obligation to secure the succession in circumstances where the legitimate king was absent and a regency government was failing. Richard of Gloucester's obligation to prevent the Woodville minority government from establishing a dominance that he regarded as damaging to the realm. Bolingbroke's obligation to recover an inheritance that had been illegally seized and to correct the misgovernment that had made such seizures possible. Whether these justifications were genuine convictions or convenient rationalizations constructed after the fact is in most cases impossible to determine, because the interior mental states of medieval political actors are generally inaccessible to historical inquiry. What is accessible, and what the narrative of 3 centuries makes unmistakably clear, is the cumulative consequence of the pattern, regardless of the specific motivations that drove individual instances of it. The betrayal of blood within the Plantagenet dynasty created a political culture in which every significant relationship of power and loyalty was haunted by the awareness that royal blood, which was the ultimate source of legitimacy, was also the ultimate source of danger. To be closely related to the Plantagenet king was to be simultaneously his most natural ally and his most dangerous potential rival. The closer the relationship, the more extreme this paradox became. Brothers were more dangerous than cousins. Sons were more dangerous than brothers, because the closer the genealogical connection, the more plausible the rival claim and the more directly the existing royal authority felt threatened. This logic, which was not peculiar to the Plantagenets, but which the specific configuration of their inheritance and their administrative ambitions made more explosive than in other dynasties, drove the dynasty toward a form of internal consumption that could only end with the elimination of the royal line, or its replacement by a line whose different configuration of claims and resources would reset the dynamic. The individuals who were most damaged by this dynamic were not, paradoxically, the kings who were deposed or the heirs who were displaced. Those men at least had the agency of political action, the opportunity to fight for their claims with the resources their royal blood provided them. The most completely consumed were those who were destroyed for the simple fact of their existence rather than for anything they had done or sought. Arthur of Brittany, who was 15 when he was captured and presumably killed, and who had done nothing to merit his fate, beyond being born as the grandson of a king whose sons had produced rival claims to the same territory. Edward of Warwick, who was 24 when he was executed, and who had spent 14 of those years in captivity, who had never sought the throne and had never been capable of seeking it, and who was killed because his existence made foreign diplomats nervous about the stability of a dynasty whose stability he had no capacity to threaten. The pages in the margins of the dynastic chronicle whose names appear briefly and then disappear, the sons of rebels who were imprisoned in childhood and emerged in middle age into a world that had no use for them, the daughters of attainted lords who found their marriage prospects permanently damaged by the accidents of their father's politics, the shadow that the Plantagenet dynastic pattern cast over English political culture in the centuries after the dynasty's end was long and complex. The Tudor dynasty that replaced them had learned, from the intimate proximity of its founders to the Wars of the Roses, lessons about dynastic stability that shaped its governance in fundamental ways. Henry VII's obsessive concern with the elimination of Plantagenet alternatives to his succession, his systematic management of the genealogical landscape to remove anyone whose descent gave them a plausible claim, his careful cultivation of parliamentary ratification for the Tudor succession, and his extraordinarily prudent fiscal management, which accumulated a treasury surplus rather than the deficits that had characterized so many of his predecessors. All of these features of his governance were direct responses to the specific lessons that a lifetime spent near the center of the Plantagenet dynastic catastrophe had impressed upon him. He understood, in a way that no purely theoretical education could have produced, that the dynasty's most dangerous enemy was the dynasty itself, and that the only protection against the mechanism of internal destruction was the systematic elimination of the conditions that allowed it to operate. Henry VIII's reign, which represents a very different application of the dynastic lessons of the Plantagenet period, demonstrates that the lessons were transmissible but not determinative. Henry VIII understood that the surplus of royal blood was dangerous, and he managed that danger with a thoroughness that exceeded even his father's systematic approach, executing members of the Plantagenet bloodline with a consistency that reduced the pool of potential rivals to near extinction by the end of his reign. But he also recreated, in a specifically Tudor register, several of the most characteristic Plantagenet mechanisms of internal destruction: the elevation of personal favorites, the systematic undermining of the institutional relationships that sustained effective governance, the treatment of royal authority as a personal possession to be deployed against any institutional actor whose independence seemed to threaten it, and the devastating inability to secure the succession through a legitimate male heir until the very end of his reign. The Tudor dynasty's own history of internal conflict, which includes the executions of Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, and eventually Mary Queen of Scots, suggests that the Plantagenet pattern of dynastic self-destruction was not simply the product of specific Plantagenet genealogy, but was embedded in the structural conditions of medieval and early modern English kingship in ways that transcended any particular dynasty's specific configuration. The final reckoning with the Plantagenet legacy requires attending to what was lost when the dynasty ended at Bosworth in August of 1485, as well as to what was preserved despite the catastrophes that punctuated its history. The dynasty that began with Henry of Anjou in 1154 and ended with the death of Richard III 131 years later had produced 12 kings, governed an empire of varying extent, fought wars across 3 continents, built some of the greatest architectural monuments of medieval Europe, created institutional frameworks whose influence extends to the present day, and killed a number of its own members, remarkable even by medieval standards. The balance sheet is not simple, and the moral accounting that any serious engagement with this history requires is not comfortable. The specific form of the Plantagenet dynasty's self-destruction, the betrayal of blood by blood, father by son, brother by brother, uncle by nephew, derived its particular intensity from the combination of an extraordinarily strong sense of dynastic identity, expressed through the consistent emphasis on Plantagenet lineage and royal blood as sources of legitimacy and authority, with an equally extraordinary incapacity to translate that shared identity into shared political interest. Every Plantagenet knew, from the earliest age at which such knowledge was accessible, that his or her royal blood was the most important fact about them. It determined their social position, their marriage prospects, their territorial expectations, their political significance, and ultimately their physical safety. It was the foundation of everything they possessed and everything they hoped to possess, and yet that shared foundation, rather than creating solidarity, consistently generated competition, because the thing that royal blood entitled every bearer of it to claim the authority and resources of the kingdom itself was finite and indivisible. There could be only one king, only one holder of the ultimate authority that royal blood validated, and every other holder of that blood was therefore both a confirmation of the authority's legitimacy and a potential challenge to its exercise. The insight that makes the Plantagenet story most historically significant, beyond its intrinsic dramatic intensity, is precisely this: that the very quality which made a dynasty strong, the proliferation of royal blood that spread legitimacy broadly and created multiple centers of political competence, was also the quality that made it most dangerous to itself. The more completely a dynasty succeeded in establishing its blood as the ultimate source of political legitimacy, the more thoroughly it created the conditions for conflict among the multiplying bearers of that blood. The Plantagenet dynasty was so successful at establishing Plantagenet lineage as the foundation of English royal authority that by the 1450s there were enough credible Plantagenet claimants to sustain 3 decades of cross, intermittent civil war, and the resolution of that civil war required the systematic elimination of Plantagenet blood from the political landscape until so little of it remained that the residual bearers posed no credible challenge to whoever controlled the military capacity of the kingdom. The institutional legacy that survived the dynasty was, in this sense, a testimony to the resilience of the social and administrative structures that the Plantagenets had built, precisely because those structures had been designed to function independently of the personal qualities of any individual king. The common law courts continued to function through the dynastic upheavals of the 1450s and 1460s because they were staffed by professionally trained lawyers whose expertise was institutional rather than personal and whose authority derived from the law rather than from the king who had established it. Parliament continued to meet through the same upheavals because the political community had come to regard it as an essential mechanism for the legitimation of taxation and the resolution of political disputes that could not be managed through purely personal royal authority. The Church continued to provide the educational and administrative infrastructure that supported governance at every level because it had developed its own institutional life sufficiently to sustain itself through the periodic crises of its relationship with the Crown. These institutional survivals, the common law, Parliament, the parish church as a unit of local governance, the exchequer as a mechanism of royal finance, are the Plantagenet dynasty's most durable contribution to English history, and their durability is a function of exactly the quality that the dynasty's personal political conduct most consistently lacked: the capacity to subordinate individual interest to institutional continuity. The institutions survived because they developed their own internal logics and their own professional communities of practice that were more durable than any individual political relationship. The dynasty failed, ultimately, because it could never develop an equivalent internal logic for the management of its own most fundamental relationships, those between the king and his blood, that could override the immediate imperatives of personal ambition and personal fear that drove the pattern of betrayal. Richard III's death at Bosworth brought to an end not merely a reign, but a dynasty, a bloodline, and a specific configuration of English political culture, whose passing, however necessary it was for the establishment of the more stable political order that followed, represented a genuine loss as well as a genuine liberation. The men and women of the Plantagenet line, for all their violence and their betrayals and their extraordinary capacity for self-destruction, were participants in one of the most consequential experiments in governance that the medieval world produced. They built institutions that outlasted them by centuries. They created a legal tradition that shaped the development of law wherever English political culture subsequently reached. They generated constitutional conflicts whose resolution established the principle, however imperfectly and incompletely expressed in their own time, that royal authority was not absolute but conditional, that it required some form of consent and some acknowledgement of mutual obligation, that even the mightiest king was not simply above all law but was himself constituted by and answerable to a framework of authority that transcended his personal will, that this constitutional insight was born in conflict, through the suffering of populations caught between competing royal ambitions and the destruction of men and women whose only crime was the possession of inconveniently distributed royal blood, does not make it less significant. It does make it more precisely understood. The Plantagenet achievement was the achievement of a dynasty at war with itself, producing its most enduring contributions not through the coherent expression of a unified political vision, but through the institutional residue of its most catastrophic failures. The common law was built partly because the royal courts needed to outcompete baronial and ecclesiastical courts for jurisdiction, which was itself a form of competition rather than principled design. Parliament developed its powers partly because successive kings needed baronial consent for military adventures that cost more than the royal revenues could sustain, which was an institutional response to fiscal crisis rather than a program of constitutional enlightenment. Magna Carta was extracted at sword point from a king who had no intention of honouring it, and its constitutional significance was established not by John, but by the subsequent generations who insisted on its reissue and its observance. The Plantagenets betrayed their own blood with a consistency and a comprehensiveness that no external enemy could have matched. They did it because the structure of what they had built made betrayal rational in ways that straightforward loyalty was not, and because the specific configuration of hereditary monarchy that they inherited and developed created a zero-sum competition for the ultimate prize that royal blood itself had validated. They left behind them a kingdom scarred by civil war, a genealogical landscape so thoroughly consumed by conflict that an entirely new dynasty, with no particularly strong claim to the throne, was able to establish itself because the alternatives were all dead or imprisoned or fled, and a set of institutional structures whose significance no one who had lived through the conflicts that produced them could possibly have predicted or intended. That combination of devastating personal failure and extraordinary institutional achievement is what makes the Plantagenet story not simply a cautionary tale about dynastic hubris, though it is certainly that, but a more complex and more illuminating account of how the most destructive political dynamics and the most durable political innovations can be produced by the same historical actors from the same historical conditions. The dynasty that ended in the mud of Bosworth Field in August of 1485 had consumed itself entirely, and in doing so had created, entirely as a byproduct of its own destruction, the constitutional framework within which its successors would govern for centuries to come.